Chapter 177. One Eye squatted on the ground, sniffed a pile of sand rhino feces in front of him, and put his index finger into it without any malice. It's still hot inside. It should have been less than an hourglass. He rubbed the dirt between his fingers with the sand and turned to look at his brother. I also smell oat auxiliary materials. The sand rhinos are well taken care of. Crooked Mouth, as his name suggested, One Eye's brother cracked his big mouth and laughed. Just like the crazy news in the desert, this sand rhino caravan has a lot of silvercate. It's a pity that the nobles and the council are too cowardly to let us do a job. The news that Keys killed the Aigu family spread to Bite City and caused a great uproar. Due to his previous achievements in the war with the Japanese and his identity as the master of the dragon nest, the Megalosaurus, the higher-ups of Medicus could not do anything to him. However, the Obsidian Council still sent out elite scouts, One Eye and Crooked Mouth, two half-baked mage apprentices who used to be bandits. They did not think so and came to investigate the recent actions of the Megalosaurus Pasha. Because of the free advertisement before, the two brothers easily found out about the sand rhino caravan with mountains of silvercate. Because of the habit of bandits, they immediately changed their target and followed the group of Fat Merchant Santos. However, these two experienced bandits did not make the mistake of being blinded by greed. Although they had been talking about doing a good job, the two brothers were very clear that attacking a sand rhino caravan that had 10 times the number of guards and a whole team of dragon family warriors accompanying them was purely digging their own graves. I heard that the Megalosaurus Pasha is going to hold some kind of gambling convention. Crooked Mouth stood up and took a sip of the lager in his water bag, thinking about something. But isn't he an evil dragon? Why would he have the strange idea of giving people silvercate? One Eye, who was tending to the saddle of the camel beast, said without turning his head, "Do you still remember the first magic book we found in the bag of the boy we killed? The book that blew up one of my eyes. How did it describe the Megalosaurus? Those creatures were much smarter than humans. Anyone who tried to take advantage of them would suffer a great loss. I'm thirsty. Give me a sip of wine." Crooked Mouth passed the water skin over. Then what should we do? Should we continue to listen to the Obsidian Council's orders? He kicked away a piece of gravel beside his feet with his broken boots. It's better to just ignore it. But you know, One Eye, our mother hoped that at least one of us could inherit the mantle of our dead father. It would be best if we could become a gray-robed mage. One Eye patted the animal's neck and sighed. Although the two brothers were not good people, they were very filial. The reason they wanted to become gray-robed mages was simple: to fulfill their mother's last wish. Their father, because he wanted to specialize in the two schools of magic, illusion, and defense. No one in the Ash world had summed up the opposing schools of magic, wasted half of his life, and was only a white-robed apprentice. In the end, he died young, leaving his two children to be raised by his wife. After their mother's death, Crooked Mouth and One Eye became bandits in order to make a living. By chance, they killed a young noble mage who was traveling and obtained his magic book, thus embarking on the path of an illusionist. The two of them had indeed inherited their father's talent in the School of Illusion. Without the guidance of other spellcasters, Crooked Mouth and One Eye had mastered some illusion tricks. For example, they could create all kinds of sounds, disguise themselves as other people, and transform into frightening poisonous snakes. It was good, but not good enough. With this ability, becoming a white-robed apprentice was not a problem. But if they wanted to become gray-robed mages, it was still not good enough. So the two brothers had to work for the Obsidian Council in exchange for the opportunity to learn advanced spells. Maybe we can consider changing employers. After drinking a large mouthful of light beer with honey, One Eye tightened the blindfold on his head. That Pasha will definitely be able to cast spells. The magic book says that Megalosaurus is a natural magical creature. But we have to prepare a proof of allegiance. Crooked Mouth, what do you think of the group of idiots sent by the Obsidian Council? In order to prepare for the Pong Convention in a month's time, Gnome City had become a large construction site. The original east and west of the city had been connected, and the skeleton laborers had built the prototype of a super bazaar. There were many uninhabited residences in the city. The skeletons carried bags filled with chalk powder and scattered the powder in a straight line. These white lines were connected together, forming a huge grid. In Key's latest plan, Gnome City would become an industrial and commercial city in the future. According to Santos' report, the heavy silver cate that had been seen by many people had taken effect. Many of the rich merchants who were friends with him had already made it clear that they would send representatives to participate in the pawn convention, although there was no time or energy to develop the remaining streets. Once the pawn convention was successfully held, the wealthy merchants would definitely flock back to Gnome City. When that time came, the land would become a money-making machine. Whether it was renting or selling, the core of the real estate business would always be the land that would be given value. Looking at the free labor in preparation, the tireless skeleton laborers set up scaffolding, simple cranes, flatbed carts, and other equipment on the construction site. They arranged the bricks, tiles, and other building materials in an orderly manner. Not long after the young blue dragon arrived in the city, the new consul, who had been sent away, represented the remaining wealthy citizens of the city and protested against the use of large numbers of undead creatures in Gnome City. However, just like the consul who had gotten his wish, the protests of the wealthy citizens were futile. After all, ordinary mortals have no way of fighting against the evil Penishade Megalosaurus. Possessing an eagle familiar, the mage flew high in the sky and looked down at Gnome City, which had turned into a construction site for the undead. A giant lizard is a giant lizard. Those who are not of our kind will have different intentions. He glanced sideways at the spy hovering in the sky. Perhaps it was because he was harvesting the leeks of the Igu family. There have been a few people trying to test the limits of Key's patience. The Megalosaurus Pasha said to Blue, who was standing beside him, "It seems like you've been trying honey barbecue recently." Like a bolt from the blue, in the clear and cloudless sky, a bolt of lightning suddenly struck, and the eagle that was struck fell straight to the ground. Out of some bad taste, Keys used a force field spell to prevent the injured familiar from falling to its death. At the same time, he used his psionic power to prevent the familiar's master from trying to break the sensory link. The half-dead eagle was caught by the ogre gourmet, who was eager to show off his culinary skills. After instructing Blue to leave some roasted meat for himself, the young blue dragon turned invisible and left the construction site of the Super Bazaar. He still had to discuss some matters with his magic consultant and take a look at the new product that the half-lich had tinkered with. It was not an exaggeration to say that it was tinkered with. After all, these things were the waste taken from the strategic teleportation portal. The Wusan had indeed plundered a lot of wealth from Gnome City, but they had also left behind a lot of things. For a researcher who had run the laboratory for more than 300 years in the bottomless abyss by himself, in order to save resources, recycling experimental materials had become Snade's personal specialty. You can't use acid magic balls to separate radiant steel. You can only use sound waves. How can you be a mage with such intelligence? Do you have a Durgar's head on your poreneck? Or did you kiss a mind flayer? Otherwise, how can you have such a smooth sulcus? The mechanical body of the steampunk half-lich let out a roar that sounded like metal rubbing against each other. Combining the quality triplet conversational skills taught by a mechanical puppet and the drow dialect of the Underdark, Snade mercilessly scolded the temporary assistant in front of him. The people who acted as his assistants were the garrison mages who had been stationed here after the recovery of Gnome City. At this moment, the black-robed mage, who was an advanced mage of Medici, was like a fledgling mage apprentice. He lowered his head and carefully accepted the stern scolding of the legendary mage. "Sorry, I'm a little out of control. To be fair, you're much better than those in gray robes, but the truth is the truth. Please don't misunderstand. I'm not targeting anyone. Everyone here is trash." Snade finally concluded. This sentence was probably taught by the mechanical puppet. Quest figures suddenly appeared, and the atmosphere became awkward for a while. Time seemed to stop for a second, and then all the garrison mages continued to do their work. There was no other way. The situation was stronger than the person. When a mage was faced with a legendary mage whose spellcasting level was almost double his own, and the legendary mage was a half-lich who was known for his evil. No matter how smooth his sulcus was, his rationality would persuade him to be obedient. Of course, in front of his own boss, the legendary mage would also change to another way of expressing himself. Your Excellency's guidance on trash sorting, coupled with the material recycling technology that I've summed up over the years, is simply a model of turning waste into treasure. Although the level of these assistants is worrying. The half-lich Snade manipulated the mechanical body and used the sign language of caring for the mentally handicapped. But we still separated a lot of expensive materials from the teleportation portal. After separating the stone materials, I conservatively estimate that we can get 400 pounds of radiant steel, 200 pounds of serene wood scraps, and about 50 pounds of 12 trees bark fragments. The steampunk half-lich took keys to see the products that had been separated. The precious materials used to build the strategic teleportation portal were piled up neatly in a special storage device. Chapter 178. Under the guidance of the mage consultant, Keyes walked into the burrow that the former called Boneyard. The smell here was not as bad as he had imagined, but it was still not easy to accept. The burrow smelled like a tannery, with the smell of rotten meat mixed with leather. There were shelves used to store corpses everywhere. In the middle, there were a few iron suitcases tied with dark leather belts, which contained the new products developed by the Demolic. Soak the flesh, whose vitality has been extracted in a solution prepared with tuber incense and beeswax as the main raw materials. Deal with it with some of the spells used to make flesh golems. After casting the spell for 2 hourglasses, remove the scattered parts. Snade said in a strict manner unique to experimental magic researchers, the biomass muscle, made in this way, can produce a spring tension of about 2,200 degrees, which is equivalent to the muscle strength of a tiger in the Ash world. Therefore, it can be said that each biomass muscle has the strength of one tiger. Seeing that the young blue dragon did not care about this strength, the steampunk Demolic continued to explain. Although this strength is not strong, the advantage of the biomass muscle is that it can be connected externally. As long as the structure is reasonable, 3 biomass muscles can produce the strength of 3 tigers, and 5 biomass muscles can produce the strength of 5 tigers. The total amount is considerable. According to my estimation, the strength of 5 tigers is equivalent to the effect of a bull's strength spell. In other words, if there's a warrior wearing a full-body biomass gear made of about 20 of these muscles, his status increase is equivalent to receiving a complete bull strength spell. Compared to spells, the effect of the biomass muscle can last for about 6 hourglasses, but after using it, it needs to be soaked in a special solution for another day to replenish nutrients and eliminate metabolic waste. It had to be admitted that as a legendary spellcaster, the Demolic's creativity was far beyond his peers. Not only did he not limit all his energy to reciting those awkward legendary spells, but he also tried to conduct rational research through more scientific experiments. Artificial muscles was a good example. Although it was not a legendary spell that could destroy a city, it could allow ordinary people to do things that could only be done with the help of mages. Furthermore, the cost was extremely low, and it was highly replicable. However, Snade's original intention of inventing was still limited to improving personal combat strength. Flesh and bone was only an important material for the exoskeleton armor he designed. However, the application of this material was far from limited. Thanks to his knowledge from his previous life, Keyes knew that similar technological products were not only used in war weapons, but also in medical and industrial fields. If it was combined with the Ash world, in terms of medical treatment, in addition to the expensive limb restoration spell and the half-golem technique, which had obvious side effects, there was another option. In terms of industrial production, the springs on the catapults, the chains on the cranes, and the braking devices on the automatic crossbows could all be solved very well with the use of the biomass muscle material. Of course, the young blue dragon did not intend to promote these ideas on a large scale now. At least before the end of the Pawn Convention in Gnome City, he would not think of a way to promote the civilian use of the biomass muscle process. After all, compared to this civilian version, the exoskeleton armor made of biomass muscle was more in line with the high-end consumer needs of the Ash world. For a long time in the future, this product would be the highlight of Keys's business blueprint. Make the best use of the time to make a set of armor, especially in terms of the outer appearance. The young blue dragon picked up the biomass muscle that had the strength of a tiger and gently touched it. It feels tough, but it seems that after the tension exceeds the strength, the muscle will lose its ability to recover. The half-lich controlled the mechanical prosthesis and took the biomass muscle that could not be restored to its original shape after being stretched by Keys. He put it back into the incubator that was soaked in solution. As long as it is not cut off with this level of tension, it will be restored after soaking in it for more than 10 days. The young blue dragon in human form nodded and then followed Snade out of the boneyard. The original residence of the consul and the overlord had been abandoned, so it had become the ground part of the half-lich's spell laboratory. The giant strategic teleportation gate in the square in front of it had been restored to a large piece of building material under the joint efforts of the garrison mage and the skeleton laborers. These building materials would be sent to the spell laboratory to extract the precious materials from the components. A group of newly summoned skeletons were dismantling the uninhabited buildings around the square. Keys had ordered the area to be cleared to the ground, and the materials taken from the dismantled buildings would be used to build a new city wall. The new city wall was not built on the outskirts of Gnome City, but on the inner city wall. In fact, if it were not for the temporary fortress left behind by the Japanese with the Skyguard Pavilion, the young blue dragon would have even thought of dismantling the original city wall of Gnome City to supplement the building materials of the inner city wall. This was not a decision made on a whim by relying on the large number of skeleton laborers. In the plan of the Megalosaurus Pasha, the newly built inner city would be his first factory. It had to be surrounded by walls to prevent people with ulterior motives from spying on it. In addition, the corresponding defenses had to be set up underground and in the air of this large factory. Underground, with the boneyard as the center, Keys let the half-lich set up all kinds of traps according to the highest standards. Anyone who tried to dig a tunnel or use spells such as Stone Traversing Spell to sneak in would be surrounded by the undead guards. In the air, not only did he arrange for the tamed eagles of the Dragonborn clan to patrol around the clock, the young blue dragon even planned to contact the merchant Yugoloth to order a batch of high-level spying magic eyes, a high-level prophecy spell with truth-knowing vision. The reason why he went through so much trouble was because the products produced by this factory were extraordinary. In the business blueprint of the Megalosaurus Pasha, Santos, who invested in the Sand Rhino Caravan, was to solve the last Paresan. More importantly, the problem of long-distance transportation of hundreds and thousands of Paresan before the last Paresan would be solved by the new type of transportation that this factory would produce in the future. In the Battle of Cloud Top, Medica's side used various factors such as weather, psychology, strategy, and tactics to defeat the Japanese airship fleet. However, the futuristic weapon that was like a sky fortress still shocked Keys. In the division of the spoils after the war, he gave up the personal belongings of the Japanese captives, slaves, and free swordsmen and mages. He only asked for a large number of torn hot air balloon skins, some ship wood, and a set of furnace equipment to heat the air. At that time, the big-bellied general advised Keys not to think about replicating an airship. That kind of thing was not only too sensitive to the medic and the Japanese, but also not cheap to make it fly. This was the cognitive limitation of the Ash world. No matter what kind of advanced technology it would be the first thing that came to mind as a weapon. The young blue dragon was actually interested in the airship's carrying capacity, as well as its ability to cruise regardless of terrain and weather. Imagine it. Hundreds of sand rhinoceroses would have to carry goods and travel for more than a month between various oases and cities. However, with airships carrying goods, they could directly reach their destination in a few days. Due to latitude, the long-distance flight path of airships was actually an arc. After a stable air route was established, the transportation industry of Medic and even the Ash world could develop by leaps and bounds. After the airship transported large quantities of goods to various distribution centers, It could rely on small teams like the Sand Rhino Caravan to flexibly complete the last pale sand transportation journey. In Keyes' plan, one of the important commercial functions of Gnome City in the future was to rely on its geographical advantage in the central region of Medic to serve as a distribution center for goods between the north and the south. As for the construction of the airship, the young Blue Dragon did not intend to copy the Japanese design. The airships that formed the Sky Fortress could not meet the needs of large-scale cargo transportation due to their military use. At the same time, as the big-bellied general had reminded him, the shape of the airship was very sensitive. It was said that the top officials of Medic and the Japanese Empire had signed an armistice agreement. At this time, Keyes had no intention of provoking the tense nerves of both sides. Therefore, the airship that the young Blue Dragon wanted to build in the future would be very different from the prototype. In fact, he was going to produce a living airship. A long time ago, Keyes had seen the heart of the blazing shadow beast from the hands of the desert elf Brock. That kind of synthetic war beast fed on black oil, and its heart was like a biological furnace engine. Inspired by the blazing shadow beast, he originally considered how to improve the Japanese furnace heating facilities, but it was soon replaced by the idea of transplanting an enlarged version of the blazing shadow beast's heart. Later, the young Blue Dragon thought of the burning sky walker that he had seen in the Worm Canyon Bitwall. Since he was going to transplant the body parts of a synthetic beast on the airship, why not just create a flying behemoth? With the help of the biochemical expert Half-Lich Snade and the knowledge about the creation of synthetic creatures that he had extracted from the soul-binding crystal, Keyes successively solved the construction of the flying behemoth's immune system, the construction of the flying behemoth's circulatory system, the growth environment of the flying behemoth, the control method of the flying behemoth, and several other design problems. Once the buyout convention in Gnome City was completed, the production materials would be stored, and the exoskeleton armor made from biomass muscle would become a hit product. Once enough funds were accumulated, Keth's Chimera Airship Factory would begin construction. Chapter 179. Brock made a simple distilling device himself. He dug a hole in the sand, placed a stone bowl at the bottom, and covered it with a small piece of cloth. The moisture at night would condense at the bottom of the cloth and fall into the stone bowl. Waiting for the stone bowl to draw out the water was a job that required patience, similar to what he was doing now. Brock picked up the roots of the plants that he had collected before the sun set and chewed them to replenish some water and nutrients. The sandworms that he had hunted were placed beside the desert elves. He needed to skin them while the flesh was still warm and remove the odor and the glands that would spoil the meat. He skillfully used the knife in his hand to dissect the prey, without the slightest worry of accidentally cutting the internal organs and contaminating the flesh. From time to time, Blatch would pick up a piece of gravel that he had picked up along the way and polish the blade. Actually, there was no need for that. The dagger that the ogre blacksmith had given him was made of Bartholomew. But this was a habit that the desert elves had developed after using obsidian weapons for a long time. Moreover, most of the habits came from tradition. According to the tradition of the desert elves, if they wanted to attend the gathering in the holy mountain, they had to bring their own food that they could share with their compatriots, not sharp scimitars or words that were comparable to fists. In the holy mountain, wind of the ancestors, the benevolent shadow of Washigu, once every 10 years, the desert elves had to abandon the disputes and hatred between the tribes and recall the history of their ancient ancestors overcoming the test of the Ash world together and taking root here. In this way, the tribes had the opportunity to communicate with each other in good faith and eliminate the estrangement and gap that had accumulated over the past 10 years. Brock recalled the last time he came to Washigu and stuffed the broken red willow branches into the fire pit that he had dug out from the ground. When the blazing sun rose from the horizon and the faint purple-red light was covered, the smoldering dried sandworm meat gave off a familiar aroma. Chewing a small piece of sandworm jerky that he made himself, the smell of melamine, a natural spice unique to this creature, lingered between his lips and teeth. His previous craftsmanship was still there. Feeling satisfied, Blatch carefully put away the food that he made for sharing and put it into a small bag on his back. After another half a day, when the galloping six-legged horse began to feel tired, the desert elves could finally see Washigu in the distance. Even from afar, the wind of the ancestors left a deep impression. Unlike the other rough and irregular mountain peaks, Washigu rose from the ground like a perfect and sharp spear. The mountain, rich in fluorite, gleamed in the blazing sun, making it look like a huge crystal set in the earth. In the shadow of the holy mountain, there was a small oasis, but there was a rare, lush forest there. Among the trees such as acacia, ginger palm, olive, tamarisk, and other plants, there were horsetail grass, thyme, trident grass, and some wormwood or millet plants. It looked exactly like the Ash World version of the elves' homeland. After tying the six-legged steed to a rock that had been set up outside the oasis, Blatch strode into the woods. In the beginning, the outer forest had tree roots exposed due to the dry weathering, but the further in they went, the more humid the air became. Finally, they arrived at the center of the forest, where there was a small lake rippling with light. Fire was forbidden in the forest, so groups of desert elves surrounded the lake to share the food they had brought. To Brock's surprise, there were more desert elves attending the gathering in the Washigu sacred ground this year. In addition to the tribes that originally lived nearby, the tribes led by Samhain and Salem, there were also many flags that he could not recognize by the lake. Following the tradition of our ancestors, we meet again in the forest. Someone suddenly began to sing a song. Without the help of sound magic, the desert elves who were chanting together turned the song into a sound wave, washing the eardrums of everyone present. As the song reached its climax, the lake in the forest suddenly boiled. Large and small fountains suddenly gushed out, and the gurgling water gathered into a fist-sized water column. Among the many water columns, there was one that was the most vigorous, and the fountain was almost at the same level as the canopy of the forest. The young desert elves who had been waiting for this moment cheered. They took off their clothes and jumped into the lake naked. This was also a long-standing tradition. Legend said that if they could step on the steps of the fountain, they would receive the blessings of their ancestors. If they could jump onto the highest spring, it would be a supreme honor. The young desert elves who were qualified to be brought to the Washigu sacred ground were the descendants of the tribal chiefs. They wanted to take this opportunity to show their agile skills to the nobles of other tribes, and to show their clever minds to their elders. Of course, participating in this competition in the sacred ground usually ended in a friendly way. Most of the young desert elves could only step on one or two springs, and then they would fall into the shallow lake. At this time, a pair of compatriots would often reach out to them, symbolizing friendship. After encouraging each other, they walked back to the shore hand in hand. Looking at these young compatriots full of vigor, Brock felt inexplicably comfortable. He took out the sandworm jerky that he had roasted himself and shared it with a supreme warrior who came from an unknown tribe. The taste of the melaleuca resin is very rich. The person who shared the melaleuca greatly appreciated Blatch's craftsmanship. Hee, those little bastards are really lively. If they were a few decades younger. Amazing! Hearing the exclamation of the supreme warrior, he looked in the direction of his finger and saw a young desert elf who had won the competition. The person was very agile, and in an instant he stepped on several fountains in a row. His movements were like a graceful dance. Good skill. Brock could not help but praise him. He knew that he could not be so agile when he was young. But when he looked again, he let out a soft "huh" in the young desert elf's hand. He was holding a sheathed sword tightly. This was very unusual. Not to mention that, generally, participating in this competition would remove their weapons to avoid accidentally injuring their compatriots. Moreover, holding an unsheathed sword was actually very disadvantageous for maintaining balance while stepping on the springs. Unless there was something wrong with the sword, it could provide extra help to the wielder, such as an increase in agility. Obed would not let go of the sword in his hand, even if he died. Even if his hands were cut off, he would still firmly bite the hilt with his teeth. As a desert elf, he knew very well what it meant to hold this sword. Extract the star iron to forge its edge, refine the blazing sun to make its light. Enemies are hard to resist, and day by day, the wielder of the sword is the king of the elves. The former mercenary leader of the wandering desert elves, after his employer in Spat died under this weapon, he unexpectedly held it in his hand. At that time, Obed knew that his fate was closely linked to this sword. Unlike a shape-shifting monster, when the wielder was a desert elf, this enchanted weapon, which was meticulously created by the Japanese mages, would have a special effect. It could fully enhance the strength, agility, and insight of the desert elves. It was with this golden blade that Obed was able to escape from Igu's mansion. Obed also found that if he held the golden sword for a long time, his appearance would change a little. Not only would he be able to return to his youthful appearance, but he would also look more handsome. These continuous changes gave birth to something called ambition in the heart of the desert elf mercenary leader. He also became more and more convinced that he was holding the golden sword that symbolized the power of the king of the desert elves in the prophecy. Not long after the Japanese Empire's invasion failed, when he learned that the Igu family had been uprooted by the Megalosaurus Pasha, Obed, who had nothing to worry about, led his men and rushed day and night to wash it. The golden sword in his hand constantly reminded him that he had to use the opportunity of the forest competition in the Holy Land to let all the desert elves bathed in the wind of their ancestors see this legendary weapon. And he, aboard, would be able to transform from a wandering desert elf to the throne of the leader of the various tribes. Stepping on the spring water under his feet, with the help of the golden sword, Obed could easily maintain his balance. The weak force carried by the spring water was enough to support his body. In 3 steps, the young and handsome desert elf overtook all his competitors. At the last moment, Obed jumped with all his strength, and, as the water under his feet exploded, he successfully stepped on the highest spring in the center of the lake. The old tribal chiefs began to talk about it, and the young desert elf kings and nobles all cheered. Enjoying the glory he had obtained, Obed adjusted his body's balance and stood up straight in the spring water that was at the same level as the crown of the tree. He pulled out the golden sword from its sheath, and the blazing sunlight that penetrated the branches and leaves shone on the weapon, shining with a breathtaking light. The sword that was held high was strangely similar to the washigu at the holy mountain. This time, all the desert elves stopped talking and cheering. They all stared at Obed, who was holding the golden sword mentioned in the ancient prophecy, and they were all silent. Pick the star iron to forge its edge, and gather the blazing sun to make its light. Enemies are hard to resist, and day by day, the sword shall be the king of the elves. Some people began to chant in a low voice, and more people joined in. In the end, all the young desert elves present began to chant, "King of the elves, King of the elves, King of the elves, this is going to be troublesome." A discordant voice sounded in Brock's heart, and at the same time, in the hearts of many desert elf tribal chiefs who continued to remain silent. The former was because they knew the truth, and the latter was because they were no longer young. Silently picking up the sandworm jerky that the supreme warrior beside him had dropped when he shouted "King of the elves," the desert elf silencer clasped his hands together, and a violent shockwave was suddenly emitted. The spring water that had been gushing just now was disturbed and fell. Obed, who was standing at the highest point, also fell into the center of the lake. Chapter 180. The mage held the energy extracted from the obsidian magic beads in his palm with a special spell-casting gesture. Feeling the power of the spell slightly stimulating his skin, the mage was very satisfied with the pleasure brought by this little hobby of his. The power surging and fluctuating in his palm was more powerful than his blood, more nourishing than eating meat and drinking water. It made him feel light and calm at the same time. He was very clear that he was not omnipotent, at least for now. Otherwise, he would have gone to confront the Megalosaurus Pasha instead of staying in the small room and waiting for the 2 minions to bring back some news. Being slightly distracted, the magic beads suddenly shattered. The mage angrily stepped on the obsidian fragments that fell to the ground. In the Medici Empire, It was impossible for gray-robed and black-robed mages to develop the habit of spell casting like him. In the orthodox mage education, using the expensive obsidian magic beads sparingly was the most basic rule of spellcasting. Only a mage of noble birth like him could get more magic beads to squander under the care of the Obsidian Council. That noble boy is wasting precious spell-casting materials again. One Eye, who had just walked in, communicated with his brother, Crooked Mouth, using hand gestures. We really should go and check the accounts with the elders of the council. That bastard boy must have stolen a lot of obsidian magic beads that should have been our reward. Crooked Mouth seemed to be resentful and disdained to use hand gestures. He opened his mouth and said, "Aren't all nobles always like this?" After saying this, the bandit chuckled in a mocking tone. However, he was still a shrewd person. Except for the sentence, "just now," the rest of his greetings to the noble mage's family were all expressed in hand gestures. The door in front of One Eye and Crooked Mouth opened automatically, and the two brothers walked in with familiarity. However, when they stepped on the carpet in the middle of the room, something strange happened. The patterned carpet suddenly turned into quicksand and caught their ankles in a split second. Sand in the carpet, a little trick. The noble mage, who was wearing a snow-white shirt and a dark brown robe with hollow silver buttons, bent down. He had no choice but to do so. The One Eye and Crooked Mouth, who had stepped into the quicksand trap in the carpet, were now covered in sand up to their necks. This is just a small punishment. Please remember, it is your honor to serve the Honorable Obsidian Council. Now, let's start the report, one after another, sentence after sentence. After the noble mage finished this sentence, the sand in the carpet disappeared without a trace. The two brothers, who were lying on the ground and panting heavily, supported each other to stand up and began to answer some of the questions that the other wanted to know. When they finished describing their findings, the door latch automatically opened again. This was obviously meant to send the guests. The young noble mage was unwilling to share the same roof with the commoners. Carefully bypassing the carpet at the entrance, One Eye and Crooked Mouth walked out of the apartment. When did you realize that it was an illusion? Crooked Mouth glanced at the window that was about to leave the room and quickly hid his eyes that were observing the two. That idiot must have never been buried. Do you remember the time when we were buried up to our chests by our peers? After the sand went up to our chests, we couldn't breathe at all. One Eye snickered and touched the blindfold on his blind eye. That's right, he replied. He's an idiot. Come on, brother. You want to get rid of that guy as much as I want to get rid of him. I know what we all hope to get from him, but do you remember how we dealt with our peers who dared to bury us alive? Wait for him to make a mistake again. Crooked Mouth grinned and said with a smile. Keys began to envy a certain ugly guy. Once in the acid fog canyon, the young blue dragon encountered an opponent who tried to charm him, a very strange-looking giant skull demon. It seemed that the guy's name was Langu. Although the ancient Obilus demons were extremely ugly, they had a unique ability. They had a unique talent in transplanting flesh and blood. Some of the strange-looking demons in the bottomless abyss were their creations. For example, the group of burning sky walkers that Keys destroyed at the entrance of Bardo Fortress. At this time, the young blue dragon admired the technology that created the Zeppelin airship behemoth. After trying dozens of methods, he found that he could not complete the basic design of such a huge flying beast with his limited knowledge of cultivating chimeras. First, the growth cycle of chimeras was much shorter than natural creatures. This was to quickly test whether the chimeras met expectations. However, according to Keys's vision of a chimera that was comparable to the size of an airship, it could not grow in a short time. This meant that their chances of trial and error were very limited. Second, the gigantic size of the behemoth determined that its body was extremely heavy. This caused its bones, muscles, internal organs, and other organ tissues to have to be strengthened. However, among the chimeras created by the soul-binding sorcerer in the past, there was no case that could be compared to the size of a gigantic flying beast. Currently, the only creature that could be used as a reference was himself. The young blue dragon could not dissect himself and analyze it in detail. Third, as a flying vehicle, the behemoth definitely needed a nervous system and a brain that was responsible for receiving and executing commands. However, controlling such a huge beast was definitely not as easy as commanding a sand rhinoceros. At present, Keyes' idea was inspired by the heart of the beasts that he needed to command the blazing shadow beasts. He hoped that the flying behemoth also had some kind of sympathetic organ. Intelligent creatures that had undergone special training or modification could use these sympathetic organs to control the behemoth's movements. However, it would take a lot of time to realize this idea, and what they lacked most was time. Keyes, the half-lich Snade, the ogre shaman Puru, and the ogre gourmet Blue, the four of them who had relatively high intelligence, did not sleep or rest for a few days, trying to solve the problem in various ways. Paru was the first to gain something. The ogre Voodoo doctor recalled that his master, the old troll known as Gru, had used a special method to communicate with other creatures. The ogre tribe that they were in had once encountered a tribe of mushroom men. Gru first collected many special spores that were emitted from the mushroom man king's body, then attached them to a rope made of mycelium that floated down from the mushroom man. Finally, relying on the regenerative ability of trolls, he implanted one end of the rope into his brain and gave the other end to the person he wanted to communicate with, the Mushroom Man King. Using the Mushroom Man's mycelium and the spores attached to it, Gru communicated with the Mushroom Man King for a long time and successfully established an alliance with the Ogre tribe to help each other. The young blue dragon was overjoyed when he found out that such a method of communication existed. He personally went to visit the Mushroom Man King that Paru had mentioned and brought back enough mycelium and communication spores to be used as experimental materials. With these two things, although he could only experiment with the zombies that Snade had awakened, the results of the experiment proved that this method of communication was effective. Now, the only problem was to transplant this thing into a living person's body. However, according to the half-lich's estimation, as long as the person who could control the giant beast in the future did not have any psychological resistance, it would not be a problem for him to create an additional organ that would not cause any rejection and could accommodate this rope into the body. However, while the young blue dragon was still worrying about how to continue the design process of the biological airship, some fellows with ulterior motives were secretly plotting against him. Chapter 181. It's time. Obed took a deep breath and stared at his prey with the crossbow. He maintained his aiming posture and felt like a long time had passed. He had to shoot the arrow before the trembling of his muscles affected his aim. He had to end this now. He pulled the trigger of the crossbow. The arrow hit its target. The rider in the distance fell from the back of the hunchbacked beast and landed heavily on the ground, raising a cloud of sand. Obed knocked another arrow and continued to aim at his opponent. As long as there was any movement, he would not hesitate to shoot another arrow. After carefully observing for a long time, there was no sign of life on his opponent's body. Only then did Obed put down the weapon in his hand and leaned against the edge of the sandpit, gasping for breath. I finally got rid of the Grim Reaper who was tailing me, he thought with some excitement. 3 days ago, Obed reached the peak of his life in the holy land of Washu. At that moment, almost all the desert elves present believed that he was the golden sword wielder and the king of elves in the prophecy. But good times were always so short. After a loud noise came from nowhere, Obed fell from the peak to the bottom of the lake. He was sure that it must be the work of a sound warlock. But when he wanted to find that person, the other party was nowhere to be found. Not only that, after the tribal chiefs were enlightened, they were only willing to call Obed's performance an interesting performance. Those old and cunning fellows actually used the excuse of saving their compatriots who suffered from the blizzard to ignore him. Anger and shame attacked the heart of the wandering desert elf mercenary group leader at the same time. He wanted to prove himself, but he could not hand the golden sword over to someone else. Obed left the holy land of Washu in anger and went to meet up with his mercenary group. He originally thought that it would only be a short journey of 1 or 2 days. Just like how he predicted that he would succeed in Washu, this was Obed's misjudgment. He and a follower only brought the most basic necessities and traveled at night on a packed beast, using the moonlight and stars to guide the way. During the day, they would let the hunchbacked beast rest and sleep under the dense shade of the nuthatch tree, or in a simple tent to avoid the dangerous blazing sun. On the first evening, when he got up, the blazing sun had not completely set. Aubert narrowed one eye and skillfully scanned the horizon. In the almost invisible distance, there was a slight disturbance in the accumulated heat haze, and a dent appeared on the horizon. There was no doubt that they were being followed. What was worse was that the stalker was obviously an expert. In order to test his theory, Aubert chose to travel in the day under the scorching sun the next day, doing the same thing as the tracker. Even in the evening, the traces in the heat haze were almost identical to the positions of the previous day. Since I can't shake him off, I'll just kill him. Aubert ordered his follower, "Go and challenge him. If you can't beat him, run this way. After I set up an ambush with the crossbow, I will be ready to support you at any time." In the end, after his entourage left, he did not return. As an experienced mercenary leader, Aubert did not suspect that his men had abandoned him and fled alone. The answer was obvious. The men he sent out had been killed by the tracker. The desert elf stayed in the sandpit dug for an ambush for the whole night, waiting for the enemy to appear at any time. He could not help but analyze who the tracker was. It's probably a supreme warrior sent by an elf tribe, Aubert secretly guessed. But why didn't he come the whole night? Instead, he came to die when the sun had just risen. But this was no longer important. He climbed out of the sandpit and relaxed his muscles and bones. With the reloaded crossbow in his left hand and the unsheathed golden sword in his right hand, Aubert walked towards his prey. However, when a mercenary leader recognized his entourage, who had a crossbow arrow stuck in his body, was bound by beast tendon ropes, and had a piece of cloth stuffed in his mouth, and was lying on the sand that was starting to get hot, Aubert instantly broke out in cold sweat. "I think we can talk." In Gnome City, the fat merchant Santos anxiously waited for the summons of the Megalosaurus Pasha. After Key's first investment was in place, the boss of the Sand Rhino caravan immediately contacted the camel farms he was familiar with and informed them to send representatives to Gnome City for a buy-in auction. But who knew that before these representatives arrived, a farm owner who was close to Santos secretly contacted him. He brought extremely bad news to the fat merchant. Someone was privately colluding in advance. They were trying to sell the sand rhinos at a price that was even higher than the average market price. After some investigation, these private colluding farms had the background of the upper nobility of Medic. Therefore, the sand rhino farms, either out of fear or because they were bribed, all agreed to the colluding proposal. They would quote a price that was impossible to sell, making the noble farm directly the trading partner of the Sand Rhino caravan. Because the other party had the background of an upper nobility, according to the usual practice, the fat merchant would have tolerated it. But Santos knew that his investor, the Megalosaurus Pasha, would hold a buy-in auction in a month. At that time, there might also be private collusion between big merchants. In order to not cause two important investments in the future to fall through, Santos felt that it was necessary to remind his investor. "You're saying that there are noble merchants colluding in private." After listening to the fat merchant's report, the young blue dragon narrowed his eyes, revealing a chilling and cruel expression. They really don't know what's good for them. Recently, there have been some guys trying to test my patience. There were very few things in the world that were discreet. Most things were inextricably linked. Keys didn't even need to think about it. The private collusion crisis that the buy-in encountered in the Obsidian Council that popped up after cutting the leaks of the Aigu family had something to do with it. It was just that he didn't understand. What good would the failure of his economic reform bring to them? Or were those people who thought they were born noble actually inbred and had some flaws in their intelligence? Or were they trying to use these little tricks to cover up some big deal? At this time, if there were professors in the prestigious 9 prisons of Bader who could personally hear Keys's inner analysis, They might give the young blue dragon a recommendation to enter the school. Only by making the brain consider the motives of others would he be able to survive the first semester there. Chapter 182. Just like those who worked in the darkness but served the light, they might be paladins, but they might also be electricians. Vice versa, those who were engaged in the dirty animal breeding business, apart from ordinary merchants, might also be quasi-aristocrats. In Medica, not all nobles could afford to build a fortress in Bite City that stood out from the rest. The fortress had a complicated shape, with spear point-like towers or tall arches. Only those who could afford to maintain these fortresses and maintain a decent life could be regarded as a higher race, high-ranking aristocrat. The higher races were all very rich. Some of them had rich lands, and they were able to earn a decent living with stable taxes. Some of them had industries like iron and steel, and the rich dividends they received were the security of their families. Some of them were like the Aigu family, who had been robbed of their crops. They had monopolized the resources of the entire city. Compared to the higher races, the ordinary nobles of Medica paled in comparison. After the empire abolished the widespread slavery system, even some nobles could not afford the commission of hiring servants. Naturally, their standard of living declined a lot. In order to maintain the most basic dignity, these nobles began to exchange wealth by giving away their noble bloodline. Rich merchants could pursue the young ladies of noble families or marry their daughters to noble sons. The premise was that they had to prepare some presentable gifts. Generally speaking, suitable betrothal gifts or dowries were industries that could continue to bring an income. In this way, merchants rose to the level of quasi-aristocrats. They were slightly inferior to nobles, but much nobler than commoners. Kamat, who ran the third largest camel breeding farm in Medica, was such a quasi-aristocrat. He obtained the status of quasi-aristocrat by marrying into a noble family as a son-in-law. This made him pay a large amount of profits every year to pay for the various expenses of a noble family. However, his efforts always paid off. Relying on his identity as a quasi-aristocrat, he expanded his business 20 times in 10 years and became one of the top merchants in the camel breeding industry in Medici. Shrewd merchants knew very well that people should not betray their class. Therefore, when the Obsidian Council gave him an order to join forces and boycott the public purchase of the Sand Rhino caravan, Kamat chose to obey immediately. Of course, according to his estimation, doing so would also bring him more income. The purchase of hundreds of sand rhinos was a big business worth close to 100,000 silver cats. In order to not make any mistakes, the merchant did not send a representative. Instead, he chose to go to Nome personally to sign the purchase agreement. Surrounded by many bodyguards, Kamat walked into the city that had just experienced the flames of war. The stand-in that had been prepared came in handy at this time. He followed the group to the hotel to stay. The merchant himself, after disguising himself, quietly left the group with 2 bodyguards. What the hell? What's going on? Passing by the 2 bazaars of Nome East and Nome West, Kamat saw workers leveling the ground with stones. But when he saw what the workers were, the merchant couldn't help but exclaim, "Blazing sun above, someone is actually using the undead creatures to work. For your safety, please, don't meddle in others' business." Kamat the same time, 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 Kamat. They weaved through the alleys and came to an inconspicuous apartment. This should be the rich district of Nome. There were still groups of people on the streets, and the apartment facing the street was a 3-story building. This is more like a place where a human should stay, Kamat muttered as he looked around and walked into the apartment. However, his judgment only lasted for half an hourglass. The commissioner of the Obsidian Council in the apartment completely changed the merchant's opinion. Anyone who wants to stay under the same roof as that guy is a brainless swine beast. After the terrible meeting, he returned to the inn where the members of the caravan were staying and ordered a large glass of lager with hibiscus nectar. While sipping in the room, he cursed incessantly. That guy must be the descendant of a quasi-noble nouveau riche. Kamat, who seriously ran the camel beast breeding business, never thought of himself as a nouveau riche. He had never experienced being bossed around from his father-in-law, a real noble who was respected by the local people. Kamat thought that since he had assisted the Obsidian Council in their operation, he should at least get some respect. However, the commissioner made it sound like he had taken advantage of them. He was pressuring him, trying to get some silver cats from the merchant's pocket. In the end, the man even used a few spells to threaten him. First, white smoke came out of the room, and he and his bodyguards were separated from each other. Then, the carpet suddenly turned into a quicksand trap. And then, just as he was recalling the scene in the hotel room suddenly became the same as the scene in the apartment, as if the scene had reappeared. Kamat immediately jumped onto the bed because he was worried that the carpet under his feet would turn into a quicksand trap again. Just as he suspected that the spellcaster of the Obsidian Council had cast a listening spell on him and came to take revenge after hearing his insults, the scene around him suddenly changed. A terrifying beast appeared in front of Kamat. The monster's body was wrapped in blue scales, but its toes and claws reflected the light of metal. Its saliva dripped to the ground and corroded a big hole in the ground. Dragon. It was a megalosaurus. The merchant immediately remembered the news he had heard before. The boss of the Sand Rhino caravan was actually managing the business for the Megalosaurus Pasha. His plan to purchase sand rhinos at a low price had undoubtedly affected the interests of the Megalosaurus. Mr. Kamat, the Megalosaurus asked as it moved its head closer. "Excuse me, what's the matter?" The merchant forced himself to calm down. "There's a trivial matter that I have to tell you. If I run over you, do you know how much damage my claws will suffer?" The Megalosaurus took a step forward maliciously. Kamat seemed to hear the sound of the floor breaking. He involuntarily screamed, but other than making the Megalosaurus look more ferocious, the scream did not help much. "Ow! How much?" the merchant asked in a trembling voice. "Not a little bit." The Megalosaurus smiled and stomped around Kamat's bed. The sound of the floor cracking continued to irritate the merchant, and he screamed again and again. Chapter 183. Your aim is pretty good. To think that I was worried that my saliva would fall askew and drip onto the merchant. Crooked Mouth was full of praise for the illusion of the Megalosaurus that One Eye had just conjured. Even though he was blind in one eye, he still had to find the right place to hold his cup when drinking. Yet, he was able to create such a realistic illusion. You did pretty well too, kid. You imitated the sound of the wooden planks cracking very well. One Eye also approved of the dubbing effect created by Crooked Mouth. He had a big, crooked mouth, and when he spoke, the air would leak out. Yet, he was able to imitate the voice to perfection. After Kamat met with the commissioner of the Obsidian Council, the two of them followed the merchant and his bodyguard to the inn where the Chamber of Commerce was temporarily staying. That was how the show came to be. That's right, everything was an illusion trick created by One Eye and Crooked Mouth. After investigating and learning what this quasi-noble, who farmed and sold camel beasts, wanted to do, the two of them immediately realized that this was a good opportunity. If Kamat chose to reconcile with the Megalosaurus Pasha after being threatened, then the benefits that the merchant brought to Keys could be considered a meeting gift between the two brothers. On the other hand, Kamat's wealth could be used as a proof of allegiance. They were worried that it would affect other people and cause unnecessary trouble. One Eye and Crooked Mouth wisely chose to use illusions. The two of them used a performance to make the merchant feel fear from the bottom of his heart. And soon, Kamat made his choice. Using an impenetrable wall of bodyguards to protect himself, the merchant hurriedly rushed to the center of power in Gnome City. Originally, he was inclined towards the Obsidian Council. One cannot betray one's own class. But at that moment, he remembered the second half of the sentence. One cannot betray one's own heart. The human heart is to seek benefits and avoid harm. Keys picked up the biological exoskeleton combat suit made by Snade and experienced the strength boost of the 5 tigers. The weak choose to rely on the strong, while the strong choose to become stronger. According to what you've said, The motivation to become stronger, or rather, humans have this kind of motivation because of some kind of fear. The steampunk Demolik said in a sentence that only philosophers would use: the fear of the unknown. Keyes experimented a little and threw a punch. There was no other problem except for a broken biomass muscle on the exoskeleton combat suit. The young blue dragon nodded in satisfaction. It's not all fear of the unknown. Human fear is always mixed with some traces of inherent knowledge. After saying that, he pointed at his combat suit and said to Snader, "Add some ferocious steel parts to this suit and give it a good name." Although it doesn't have any practical use, the buyer will feel that it's more powerful and will be more willing to spend more money. They were originally busy trying to solve the technical problems related to the flying behemoth, but as the tournament was approaching, more and more businessmen came to Gnome City. Keyes and his magic consultant had to take some time out to adjust the exoskeleton combat suit that was about to be launched as the main profitable product. When they were about to finish their work, the military officer outside the door sent a message that someone wanted to see them. After passing through the newly built inner-city gate and standing in front of the Megalosaurus Pasha, Kamat began to doubt the wisdom of surrendering empty-handed. He had found a good reason for this, but he knew very well that he was betrayed by his own cowardice. The king of the dragons, the interceptor of the Japanese, the great Pasha who controls the earth, the sky, and all the métis living here, the honest merchant, the son-in-law of a noble, and the heir of Shek, Kamat greets you. Using a set of etiquette that he had practiced for a long time, the merchant first greeted Keyes, the Megalosaurus Pasha, to show his respect. Then he said the real purpose of his visit. "I hope that your excellency can give me a chance to turn over a new leaf. Although the people of the Obsidian Council came to force me to collude with a few of my peers in advance to raise the purchase price of the Sand Rhino Caravan, they didn't succeed. So that's what happened." Previously, when Santos reported that a camel beast breeder with a noble background tried to control the transaction price, Keyes guessed that this matter had something to do with the Obsidian Council. But he didn't expect that the merchant would come personally to surrender. And this merchant, named Kamat, was very afraid of him. Judging from his expression, it was as if he was afraid of being eaten alive. Out of curiosity, the young blue dragon used his psionic ability to continuously guide Kamat. It was only until the merchant explained the conflict between him and the Obsidian Council Commissioner, and then the encounter with the Megalosaurus, in the end that Keyes used the suggestion spell to make the merchant feel that his flattery had won the Pasha's favor, and he left at ease. "It seems like someone is helping us." The steampunk half-lich, who had been staying behind the pillar, walked out and communicated with the young blue dragon. "It's also possible that they aren't helping us, but are deliberately trying to frame the Obsidian Council." This undead creature born as a drow had a high racial talent in identifying conspiracies. But to Keyes, it didn't matter even if it was a conspiracy. Anyway, he was just the knife in the borrowed knife to kill with a borrowed knife. He could use this opportunity to probe why the Obsidian Council was deliberately targeting him. Could it really be because he had taken the leak from the Aigu family? Seeing the skeleton laborers, who were originally working at the Super Bazaar, suddenly gathered together and walked toward the street in unison, the two brothers immediately realized that the Pasha had received their big gift. The two bandits immediately organized their equipment and pretended to be panic-stricken. They ran to the commissioner's apartment and knocked on the door. After a while, the young mage of the Obsidian Council let the visitors into the room. "Master, I have to remind you." After One Eye entered the door, he carefully avoided the carpet in front of the door. This action made the young mage sneered slightly. "I see those skeletons are surrounding this street. That evil Megalosaurus and his men must have nailed us. We have to leave immediately." The young mage took out a small pinch of silver powder and some cis spores from the inner pocket of his dark brown coat. He immediately drew energy from the obsidian magic bead he carried with him and activated the detection spell he had set up in the nearby house in advance. This The noble mage couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air when he saw the numerous skeleton laborers carrying all kinds of tools and transforming into undead warriors as they slowly walked towards his residence. "We can't hesitate. We have to evacuate immediately," One Eye said eloquently to the commissioner. In the commissioner's opinion, there was even a risk that his remaining eye would suddenly burst out. "We can't ride the flying carpet. That thing can't outrun the megalosaurus. Now, we can only escape from the encirclement and think about other things later. I've already asked Crooked Mouth to make preparations upstairs." One Eye had to admit that One Eye's considerations were very meticulous. There was no chance of winning if they raced against the megalosaurus in the sky with a flying carpet. "What do you want to do?" the young mage asked One Eye and Crooked Mouth as he considered the possibility of using spells to break out of the encirclement. "Why do we need to go up to the roof to break out? We'll use a rope." At this time, Crooked Mouth ran down from upstairs and gestured to One Eye. "I've already set up a ropeway on the roof. This rope has been cast with an illusion spell. It won't attract anyone's attention for half an hourglass. Currently, there are only some skeleton soldiers and city guards. If we wait for the garrison mages to join in, we won't be able to escape quickly." After listening to Crooked Mouth's explanation, the young mage didn't doubt him. He hurriedly put away his bag and followed the two up to the roof. This residence was originally 4 stories high. Crooked Mouth had just come up and inserted a long pole into the soil of the roof and firmly tied it to the roof decoration. The rope that was used to set up the rope was tied to the top of the pole. "Is this sturdy?" Looking at the height between the roof and the ground, the young mage frowned and couldn't help but ask. Crooked Mouth seemed to be a little emotional. This banded illusion mage took off his robe and revealed the bulging muscles on his arms. He pulled the rope with a knot on it and held it with one hand before quickly leaving via the rope. Seeing this scene, One-Eyed and the Obsidian Council Commissioner smiled awkwardly and escaped into the distance through the rope they had set up. The two brothers used their actions to prove the feasibility of escaping via rapid descent, as well as the sturdiness of the rope. At this moment, the shouts of gnomes, city guards chasing the citizens of the surrounding streets could be heard. The young mage understood that if he continued to hesitate, it was very likely that he would be forced to fight with those soldiers. He had to leave immediately. He placed the last piece of rope that One Eye and Crooked Mouth had left behind on the rope, and used the dangling rope to wrap around his frail arms a few times. This was to prevent his hands from slipping or from losing his grip and falling down. After doing all this, he leapt out from the roof and slid down the rope. However, what he didn't know was that not only was his rope not tied with a knot to slow him down, it was even lubricated with tung oil. Thus, after the young mage hung his entire body on the rope, he continued to slide down faster and faster under the influence of his own gravity. Fortunately, just as he was about to land, he found a small patch of sand beneath his feet. However, his hands were still bound tightly by the rope, and he couldn't move at all. He wanted to chant a few spells to solve the problem, but in a moment of desperation, he actually bit his tongue. This commissioner of the Obsidian Council could only try to curl up his body to protect himself at the last moment. It seemed that luck was on his side again, and the hard landing shouldn't have caused too much damage. He propped himself up and felt the pain from the extra bruises all over his body. "Quick, help me up." The young mage asked for help in a rare instance. "I'm afraid that won't do, sir." One Eye's unique tone appeared once more. "There's really quicksand beneath your feet now." Chapter 184. "I'm sure." Crooked Mouth twitched his mouth and signaled his brother to look at the goods in the wooden barrel under his feet, a guy wearing a brown worker's coat full of patches and stains. For the sake of transportation safety, the goods had fallen into a coma caused by some physical means. This kid's noble status is at most 2 generations back. His grandfather's generation must have been a commoner. Look at how he looks in this set of clothes. It's so fitting Usually, at this time, One-Eyed would always say the word grandfather with Crooked Mouth to belittle the noble mage. But this time, he did not pay attention to his brother's teasing words. Instead, he solemnly asked himself, "We're considered to have betrayed the Obsidian Council. If the Megalosaurus Pasha doesn't take us in, then there's really no way out. Crooked Mouth was silent for a while and stepped on the wooden barrel under his feet. The key is to see if this meeting gift is to the Lord's liking. Seemingly aware of the negativity in his words, the bandit mage encouraged his brother. It's not a big deal. There will be a way when the time comes. Besides, we found a lot of good things from this kid. Even if we have to run for our lives, we can survive for a few years. The two of them chatted with each other about their future plans. From time to time, they also used physical means to ensure the safety of the four-wheeled camel vehicle. In short, One-Eyed and Crooked Mouth successfully brought the noble mage belonging to the Obsidian Council the keys. You seem to be a little afraid. That's good. Please maintain this. The young blue dragon in human form was very satisfied with the trembling of the two banded illusion mages. If you're pretending, then please continue to maintain it. In fact, Keys did not care whether the two of them were really afraid of him or not. Perhaps some people would think that this was the pride of the Megalosaurus, but in fact, it was the pragmatism of the young blue dragon. As a ruler, he knew very well that he had to use persuasion and not always force people to submit. A ruler must be the best coffee maker to attract the best talents. Of course, there are many types of persuasion. It could be magical or physical, but Keys preferred to use facts to convince others. A naked man has few secrets, but a man with torn skin has no secrets. Standing in the dungeon, Keys explained what the steampunk half-lich was doing to the two brothers who came to surrender. Upon hearing Keys's words, Snade controlled the artificial body and shook his index finger at his employer, which meant not only that. All right, let's first look at our surroundings. This was the basement of the Demolica's laboratory, the former residence of Senator Gnome. It was originally an ice cellar used to store ice, but it had been transformed into a dungeon. The cold air that had accumulated over the years had made this place particularly cold and damp. Coupled with the presence of the powerful undead leader, the entire dungeon appeared even more ghastly. There was no doubt that Snader was proficient in the art of interrogation. Being in the dungeon that he had personally set up, everything around him seemed to be constantly magnifying the senses of the torturers. Every bit of pain was more three-dimensional and profound. Under the effect of the special incense, the commissioner of the Obsidian Council quickly woke up. However, the headache caused by the physical method used by the brothers One-Eye and Crooked Mouth still troubled him. The young mage couldn't help but groan in pain. After taking 2 deep breaths, he was about to open his eyes when another type of incense triggered another reaction. His eyelids were affected by his subconscious and closed again. He fell into a state of wandering consciousness. Try to concentrate, expand the arteries, eliminate all distracting thoughts. Only the part of consciousness that he had chosen. His blood became abundant and quickly flowed to the overloaded area. This was a meditation method that all mages would learn. It could help human mages transcend the senses of beasts and touch on a deeper level of perceptual experience. In the process of learning spells, it was often very effective to consolidate the memory of spells in a meditative state, because human senses were more sensitive at this time. The Demolic didn't even let the gargoyle servant use too much force. The whip only left a shallow bloodstain on the young mage who had been stripped naked. The mage couldn't help but groan in pain. Due to the limitation of the meditative state, the pain caused by the wound was magnified several times, constantly tormenting the torturer. In the knowledge of ordinary people, the process of punishment was usually interspersed with interrogation. However, the young mage wasn't questioned at all. The interrogation of the Drows was to ensure that the torturer would be willing to tell everything that had happened since he was born after destroying every bit of resistance. There is no doubt that the commissioner of the Obsidian Council was far from a tough guy, no matter how one looked at it. Even before the gargoyle finished warming up and the number of whips didn't exceed a single digit, the young mage had completely given up resistance. As the enchanted torture device that bound him changed from red to dark green, which symbolized obedience, the interrogation entered a one-sided questioning process. After being splashed with a mixture of ice and water, the torturer slowly woke up while trembling. "Hurry up and tell us the truth. The gargoyle executioner tightened his grip on the whip, making a loud crack. "If you dare to hide anything, don't think about getting out of here alive. Hurry up and tell us. Just ask." The young mage wanted to cry, but had no tears. After a round of interrogation, Keyes basically figured out the reason why the Obsidian Council was targeting him. First, it was indeed related to the leaks that he had taken from the Aigu family. The young blue dragon's quick and decisive decision to overthrow a noble family was unexpected. Some even suspected whether it was Pharaoh or the Great Vader's instructions behind it. Second, after forcing the Wusong to sign the Agreement of Defeat, the Great Vader stopped all official activities. Some suspected that the strongest mage of Medic was seriously injured and needed to rest. Therefore, the Obsidian Council chose this time to start attacking the forces related to the Great Vader. The young blue dragon couldn't help but secretly gnash his teeth as he thought, "It's just sitting at home, but trouble comes from the sky again," including the Wusong people and the green-legged dragon snakes sent by them. This was already the third time he had been targeted by the Great Vader. If it weren't for the title of Pasha on top of his head, it would be of great benefit to his future plans. Keyes even thought of flying above the Great Vader's mansion in Bite City and shooting him with a super electromagnetic gun. But now was not the right time. He had to wait until the flying behemoth was created, or at least until the trading fair in Gnome City was successfully held. Otherwise, all his previous efforts would be in vain. Keyes kept reminding himself. In an apartment in Gnome City, the two brothers One Eye and Crooked Mouth were nervously busy. It was not the worst situation they had imagined. In fact, the treatment given by Keyes was even better than they had expected. Not only did the two brothers receive advanced learning materials in the field of illusion, but they also received enlightenment guidance and transformation spells from the strange-looking magic consultant of the Megalosaurus Pasha. In exchange, One Eye and Crooked Mouth had to use their own work in exchange for remuneration. In the eyes of the two brothers, this treatment was simply too satisfactory. Therefore, they worked very hard. 2 days later, more and more merchants came to Gnome City to participate in the poker tournament. Following the model of the Dragonborn clan's town, Keyes divided the already formed Super Bazaar into stalls, and some merchants who had paid taxes began to settle in. Until the first trading fair began. In front of many merchants, Santos of the Sand Rhino Caravan personally broke the narrow-mouthed clay jar containing the bidding scrolls of various competing camel farms, and announced that Kamat's farm, whose price was only 3/5 of the market price, would be the caravan's licensed supplier for the next 2 years. The atmosphere of this business fair began to boil. The merchants could not help but feel their blood boil, especially when they saw the Sand Rhino Caravan pay half of the deposit in front of everyone, a total of 15,000 silver cars, which shone with a soul-stirring light under the blazing sun. This was just the beginning. Large quantities of goods purchased by the Megalosaurus Pasha, such as steel, minerals, food, stone, weapons, and armor, would cause a commotion among the merchants every time the money was handed over. Fortunately, there was a large group of elite warriors transferred from the Dragonborn clan to maintain order in Gnome City's Super Bazaar, so there was no unnecessary trouble. After the agreement was reached, merchants like Kamat did not leave immediately. They gathered their peers, held a banquet to celebrate, and at the same time, discussed small-scale trading fair business. In fact, before the agreement was made, the shrewd merchants had calculated the scale of their own business. For Kamat's farm, he did not have the ability to deliver more than 100 sand rhinos in one go. But the reason he still dared to offer a price was because he could subcontract another part of the agreement after winning, and he just needed to make up the total before the final delivery. In this way, the wealth that Keyes had collected from the Aigu family flowed out like water. In just a few days, hundreds of thousands of silver cars had flowed into the pockets of hundreds of large merchants and even more small merchants. But this was the young blue dragon's intention. Using the wealth in his hands, he leveraged the merchants of Medic to gather their goods in Gnome City. The trade route that had been sealed for months began to be reopened. At the same time, as more and more merchants stayed in Gnome City, the work that One Eye and Crooked Mouth were in charge of was nearing completion. Chapter 185. Rules were the embodiment of order, just like how big fish ate small fish, or how big cities needed to be supported by small towns and villages. Everything had its own place in the multiverse. Of course, the rules were not always the same, because change itself was the embodiment of another great force. The multiverse also needed some chaos, just like how small fish could grow up, or how small towns and villages could become bigger cities. It was the same for Medicus's business operations. Every merchant and every product had its own place, but at the same time, it was in a dynamic balance of competition. And the emergence of a new product was bound to slightly break this balance. If this product could be a great success, the smart producers would definitely find a way to quickly insert it into a new place so that more people would pay attention to their products. Consumers, distributors, agents, all kinds of business roles would quickly take their place, and a new product would create a new balance. In the world of Key's previous life, the process of finding a new balance point was called marketing. The Fanatic armor was a biological exoskeleton armor jointly developed by the half-lich Snade, responsible for the development, product design, and product production of the biomass muscle, and the Megalosaurus Pasha, responsible for the name. It also needed marketing at the beginning of its introduction. Different from some of the fake masters in his previous life who only knew how to talk big, Keys, as a Penishade evil dragon, was very particular about practical results, so he would not use self-exaltation like slogans for publicity. And as a Pasha, any of his actions at a higher level would easily attract the attention of many forces. For example, the Obsidian Council, which represented the interests of the noble mages. As a big gift from One Eye and Crooked Mouth who had surrendered, there was no record of the young mage being captured. After being subconsciously affected by a spell, the noble mage was secretly released. He could not even recall the process of being tortured that normal people would not forget. When he learned that the Dragon Pasha, whom the council had been keeping a close eye on, was preparing to auction off the first Fanatic armor, he directly applied for special funding from the high-level mage of the council, who was in direct contact with him, to purchase this armor that was unprecedented in the entire Ash world and conduct reverse research. In their view, if the Fanatic armor was really as advertised, without the need for obsidian magic orbs, and with the same enhancement of strength as Ox strength, then it would be very worthwhile to spend a lot of money to buy it and research and imitate it. If this armor was not as good as advertised, they could also expose it. From the information they had obtained, the Megalosaurus Pasha had built an inner city in Nome for mass production. Once his plan was ruined, the giant dragon would definitely suffer heavy losses due to the huge investment in the early stages. Therefore, on the day of the auction, the young Obsidian Council Commissioner managed to win over the other interested tycoons with a high price of 10,000 silver cats and successfully obtained the first test model of the Fanatic armor. After the successful auction, the noble mage immediately left Nome with this reward. In his view, his participation in the auction had already exposed his identity. In fact, it was earlier than that, so he specifically asked the two brothers, One Eye and Crooked Mouth, to leave that night. The three of them could cast spells to cover their tracks. You two need to be more alert. For some reason, the noble mage felt a dull pain in his head whenever he saw One Eye and Crooked Mouth. However, he still patiently reminded them, "The goods we are purchasing this time are of great importance. You must send it back to the big boss safely." The two brothers smiled and nodded as a reply. During the rest of the journey, the young mage took advantage of the time when One Eye and Crooked Mouth ran away to relieve themselves. He curiously looked at the Fanatic armor, wrapped in a paraffin film. From the appearance, this armor, which Keys thought was highly replicated, was very ordinary in the eyes of the Obsidian Council. Brass wires as thick as a pinky finger formed the twisted exterior of the armor. Other than increasing its weight, it did not have any defensive function. The breastplate, backplate, shoulder plate, and tibia plate were all riveted together using a special method. They were all chained together with white silk, making it very inconvenient to wear. Some cheap leather seemed to be used as the inner lining of the armor, because there was always the smell of medicine used to treat leather. but it was still a high-grade product worth 10,000 silver cats. The young noble mage could not help but be curious about the strength enhancement effect equivalent to Bull's strength enchantment. He tore open the paraffin film, but he did not notice the words, "Once opened, no returns," printed on the film at the corner. The flexible way in which Bai Yin connected the armor had slightly changed his view of the armor. Although it was still quite tiring to wear it, compared to other armors that could not be worn by a single person, the fanatic armor was much more convenient. And to his surprise, this armor, which did not have any magical fluctuations, actually had an enhancement effect on the wearer's strength. As a mage, his physical fitness was not bad, but it was still incomparable to that of a warrior. But after wearing the fanatic armor, he tried to lift the luggage that was used to tie the camel-binding beast, One Eye, and Crooked Mouth together. He could lift it easily. This is indeed a new form of enchantment. The young mage was really surprised. Of course, he did not know the effect of the biomass muscle on the armor. If the Obsidian Council can master this technology, the noble army of Medic, no, only a part of the elites will be equipped with this armor. Then enemy attack. Bandits are approaching. One Eye and Crooked Mouth, who had just returned from relieving themselves, began to shout from a place far away from the temporary camp. After the young noble heard the news, he did not remove the fanatic armor. Instead, he put on the robe that he had just taken off. One Eye ran back first. He untied the rope that tied the camel-binding beast and said, "I need your help. I can't lift this luggage myself." It was different from a usual situation where he was unwilling to do any physical labor due to his arrogance. The noble mage, wearing the fanatic armor, only needed to extend one hand to help One Eye successfully place the luggage on the camel-binding beast's back. "I really didn't expect you to be so strong," One Eye praised as he lowered his head to fasten the belt buckle of the luggage. Of course, the mage would not explain to him that this was the effect of wearing the fanatic armor. He only asked calmly, "What's going on? We didn't make a bonfire. Why are there bandits attacking us?" The one who answered his question was Crooked Mouth, who hurried back from the top of the sand dune. "I just took a look. It should be people from Gnome City. From the symbols that they use to light the torches between their teams, I think it should be Boar personally leading them." "Boar?" The young noble flipped onto the camel-binding beast's back and asked softly, "Damn it, I knew it." One Eye, who had climbed up the rope ladder, slapped his thigh and reached out his hand to pull his brother up. "A Pig and Whistle tavern opened in Gnome City in the past 2 days. Isn't that the guy's usual method of gathering information?" The two illusionists, who were once bandits, spoke one after another. They told the young noble mage a lot of stories that were mixed with the industry slang of the bandits. To put it simply, it was because they had exposed their wealth when bidding for the fanatic armor. When they left, they did not have fierce caravan guards like other big merchants. That was why they were targeted by the bandits in Gnome City, which led to an attack by a desert bandit nicknamed Boar. After they had taken a few steps forward on the camel-binding beast, Crooked Mouth and One Eye looked at each other. The two of them took out an obsidian magic orb at the same time and began to chant an incantation to cast a spell. The noble mage identified a few runes in the spell. He knew that the two brothers wanted to use an illusion trick to create some hazy images. It would be easy to see through during the day, but it should be useful in the dark. 2 black shadows gushed out from the palms of the two brothers respectively, forming the shape of a hunchback in the air with 3 people on its back. The hunchbacks ran in 2 different directions. This might not be useful. Perhaps it was because they were in the same trench, but the noble mage of the Obsidian Council avoided some taunting words for the first time. He patiently explained, "A simple illusion summoned from the Shadow Realm can fool the bandits from afar. But when you get closer, you will find that there are no camel-binding beast footprints in the first place. The wind is not strong tonight, so the real footprints we left behind will definitely stay for a long time." One Eye and Crooked Mouth looked regretful. "Damn it, we wasted 2 obsidian magic orbs." Crooked Mouth tried his best to suppress his hoarse voice as he said in annoyance, "One-eyed, do you remember? I heard that even though Boar is extremely ugly, he's very cunning. This illusion will definitely not deceive him. One Eye, who was rather old, ignored Crooked Mouth's complaints and turned to ask the noble mage who looked normal. Then what should we do? Crooked Mouth and I definitely won't have a problem fighting one-on-one. We can also barely deal with 5-on-1. However, Boar might have brought 100 people with him. Even if we use all our tricks, including those illusions, we won't be a match for them. He did not emphasize that the three of them could not escape on the camel-binding beast. In fact, it was useless to mention it. Even if One Eye and Crooked Mouth got off the camel-binding beast and fled separately, this kind of commercial camel-binding beast would not be able to outrun the six-legged warhorses used by the bandits. The noble mage pondered for a moment and carefully calculated the difference between the two sides. Then he took out a small bag full of obsidian magic orbs from his robe. This was an additional material he applied to satisfy his little hobby of magic by taking the opportunity to apply for special funding. It came in handy at this moment. After giving 2 or 3 magic beads to the One-Eyed and Crooked Mouth brothers, the young mage patted the fanatic armor he was wearing under his robe. This equipment gave him some peace of mind. Let's find a way to kill this boar so that we can escape smoothly. Chapter 186. When the conditions are right, success will follow naturally. This was the concept of deception that One-Eyed and Crooked Mouth brothers used. Illusions were an important means for them to complete the entire chain of deception. After receiving the order from Megalosaurus Pasha, the two of them tried their best to show off their skills in front of their new boss. They came up with a plan of deception. First, and also the most difficult part, they had planned for a long time. Finally, they waited for the bandit group that dared to plant spies in Gnome City, the Pig Rush bandit group, led by Boar, as well as the spies they planted, the Pig and Whistle Tavern. One-Eyed and Crooked Mouth visited the tavern with a strange name in batches. The string of bone whistles hanging on the signboard explained the second half of the tavern's name, and the fat face of the tavern owner confirmed the other part. The two brothers summarized the results of their observations and concluded that the owner who looked more like a pig than a human was the bandit leader, Boar. After wasting a lot of cute copper debentures on the swill beer provided by Pig and Whistle, One-Eyed and Crooked Mouth finally had the chance to sit in front of Boar at the bar. They worked together to cast a spell that their new boss had taught them, Scrooge's Envy. However, they had not mastered this enchantment spell yet, so when One-Eyed chanted the spell, Crooked Mouth had to distract Boar with words, making him ignore or unable to investigate the strange syllables coming out of One-Eye's mouth. After trying 2 or 3 times, they barely managed to complete the spell. They spent a lot of materials and energy and endured many glasses of sour beer that were hard to swallow. However, this was indeed a rather crucial part. After the envy of the miser took effect, the boar would have a great desire to possess the mad armor, and the bandit leader would do whatever it took to obtain this treasure. In addition, One-Eyed and Crooked Mouth also discovered other bandit spies one after another. However, these bandits were not as powerful as the Pig Rush bandit group and were less well known. They could only be considered as supporting characters in the whole big show. After dealing with the actors, the next thing to do was to deal with the setting. The two brothers first spent an entire day designing all kinds of props that would be used, such as fireworks, pit flippers to stop the camel beast, iron caltrops, fake obsidian council letter scrolls, and so on. Then, they secretly transported these props out of Gnome City, and according to the camel beast route, they would bury or set them up in a suitable place in advance. Everything was arranged properly. In order to ensure that there were no mistakes, they even came up with several backup plans. After the actors and setting, the mad armor, after all, under the orders of Megalosaurus Pasha, to use this series of arrangements to promote the excellence of the mad armor. In other words, they have the big show, Crooked Mouth, was Crooked Mouth, in particular, they had to trick a noble mage into believing that they were only carrying out the orders of the Obsidian Council. When the mage obtained the mad armor from the auction and left Gnome City, Crooked Mouth and One-Eyed began to use all kinds of illusions to disrupt his perception. By distorting some light, they walked for half a day, but in fact they were not far from Gnome City. Fortunately, they were traveling at night and could not do it during the day when the sun was blazing high in the sky. But even with such a meticulous design, there was still a major oversight. Perhaps they had mistakenly overestimated the abilities of the Pig Rush bandits. After riding on the camel beast for half a day, they did not find any trace of the boar and his men following them. As a last resort, the two of them used the excuse of letting the camel beast rest to temporarily stop for a while. The Pig Rush bandits finally arrived at the predetermined location about an hourglass later than the original plan. One-Eyed and Crooked Mouth were then able to continue to bluff the noble mage into the next step, to let him personally decide to kill the bandits. "What are you going to do?" One-Eyed's remaining eyeball flashed with a dangerous light. "I'm saying that against more than 100 people, it's definitely not going to work if we fight them head-on." Crooked Mouth, who was squatting on the back of the camel beast, suddenly stood up, looked into the distance, and bent down again. He said to the two, "It seems that the boar has divided his men into 3 groups. We have some time to prepare, but we still have to make a decision immediately. They may discover that there's something wrong with the 2 illusions in a while." The young noble mage looked at his 2 subordinates and told them his plan. First, find a sand dune to set up camp, then light a bonfire to lure them over. Seeing the surprised looks on One-Eyed and Crooked Mouth's faces, he explained patiently, which was rare for him, "We'll make our illusions in the camp as realistic as possible, and we'll use spells to hide in the darkness. When they find out that we're outnumbered, they'll definitely attack first. They've divided their men into 3 groups, which means that we only need to deal with about 30 people at a time. As soon as they start to attack the illusions, I'll use evocation spells to launch a sneak attack. With the abilities of the 2 of you, killing half of them shouldn't be a problem. And then, there's still a dozen of them." Crooked Mouth scratched his head, apparently feeling that this idea was a little hasty. "If the other 2 groups come over, we'll still have to face 50 to 60 enemies, or even more. That depends on the abilities of the 2 of you. The key is to grasp the timing of the bonfire. Besides, the young mage tightened his robe and continued, even if half of Medicus's regular army is killed or wounded, they'll immediately retreat. The small team will probably flee when attacked. If we're lucky, we can set up 2 ambushes, and maybe we'll be able to defeat the Porcupine Bandits." Just like that, the whole show was back on track. One-Eye and Crooked Mouth quickly chose a suitable ambush spot, which had been set up with props. They pretended to find a sand nest with a few large rocks and placed a hunchbacked beast with their luggage inside. They first tied the reins of the camel beast to the top of the stone mine and directly lit a bonfire on the ground without unloading the luggage. The 2 of them also used illusions to pretend that 3 travelers were talking to each other. Then, they climbed up the sand ridge above their heads and used some magic to erase the footprints left behind by their footsteps. "Let's use Fireball," One-Eyed suggested to the young mage who was hiding in the sand after climbing up the sand ridge. "We'll stick the camel beast in the crevice of the rocks. If the fireball can hit the other side of the bonfire, it shouldn't hurt the beast." The other party nodded, indicating that he understood the importance of the camel beast when trekking in the desert. The 3 of them did not speak anymore. They lay prone in the sand pit and used magic to hide their figures, quietly waiting for the boar to take the bait. Not long after, someone shouted, and the neighing of horses came from not far away. Sure enough, after seeing that there were only 3 people in the camp, the bandits immediately chose to launch a surprise attack. It was not much different from what they had expected. There were only about 30 people in this group. Most of them were equipped with 2 people and 1 horse, and the weapons on them were not uniform. They only launched a charge because they had more people, but their horse riding skills were still remarkable. At the beginning of the charge, the bandits sitting behind the riders took advantage of the slow speed to jump off their horses and advance on foot. After lightening the load, the 6-legged horses' speed increased again. The leader of the riders whistled, and the horses suddenly split into 2 groups, flanking the illusion of the camp from the left and right. This formation had obviously been practiced many times. They wanted to cut off any attempt of the target to escape. In the process of the charge, the bandits also let out a roar that sounded like a battle song, but also like a meaningless, angry roar. As former colleagues, One-Eyed and Crooked Mouth were very familiar with this method. They understood that the other party wanted to use this method to make the enemy feel afraid. Therefore, they cooperated with the roar of the bandits and constantly adjusted the illusion of the camp, making the three travelers appear to be panicking. The bandits' first wave of attack was throwing axes. The riders on horseback did not take the initiative to attack the enemies after they surrounded them. Instead, they grabbed some small axes hanging from the saddle and threw them. From an economic point of view, these axes were rarely made of metal. Most of the axes were made of gravel and tied to a short wooden stick. However, with the speed of the horses and the force of the rotation, the flying axe's lethality was still considerable. If an ordinary illusion mage were to encounter such a situation, their illusion would probably be exposed on the spot. However, One-Eyed and Crooked Mouth, who were prepared, had already thought of this problem. The two of them controlled the illusion to run to the pile of rocks in the sand to hide. Seeing that the flying axes did not have the desired effect, most of the riders were a little annoyed. However, they still waited for their companions to rush over on foot. When they had all rushed into the sand, they slowly surrounded them. Not good, this is a trap. The illusion that was attacked was annihilated with a poof, allowing the bandits to react. However, at this time, the noble mage who had already prepared a spell had already thrown the fireball spell. Attacking from the top of the sand ridge made it easy for him to cast spells on the densest group of desert bandits. With a boom, the few people who came into close contact with the fireball were instantly blown to ashes. Some of the nearby bandits were also injured by the shockwave and flames, and were sent flying with a cry of pain. One-Eyed and Crooked Mouth, the two brothers, also rushed down at this time, hacking at the bandits who were stunned by the fireball. As for the noble mage himself, because he was wearing the zealot armor, his courage was greatly boosted, and he also jumped down from the sand ridge. He pinched the bat feces and sulfur powder in his hand, and together with the spell, he rubbed out another fireball and threw it at a few riders who were standing close together. Boom! Another explosion sounded. The bandits, who did not have any resistance to magic, and their war horses, were blown into pieces of broken limbs and bones flying in all directions. Coupled with the hacking of One-Eyed and Crooked Mouth brothers, at this time, this small group of bandits only had a few riders who were standing further away. Suddenly, one of the bandits fired something like a signal flare. Several fireworks flew high into the sky and exploded in the night sky. Chapter 187. Generally speaking, there were two ways for bandits to obtain information. The first was to plant spies or informants, just like how Boar had opened the Pig and Whistle Tavern in Gnome City. However, this required a certain amount of financial resources and patience. The second way was to purchase information from information peddlers. Of course, there was a reason why information peddlers were called information peddlers. Every question they asked gave them an additional clue to the true motives of their customers. Even a meeting with them could become information that could be sold to others. Therefore, for bandits, it was best to buy as little information as possible from information peddlers. If they really had to, they had to choose some veteran information peddlers with a better reputation. Coincidentally, the brothers One-Eye and Crooked Mouth were somewhat famous in this line of work. Information related to the zealot armor had been wantonly exaggerated by these two and spread to the ears of many bandit groups. Although the bandits did not dare to act rashly in Gnome City, where the Megalosaurus Pasha was stationed, after the successful bidding, the armor was taken away from the city by the young noble mage. This made many people's minds become active. It was not only professional bandits. Under One-Eye and Crooked Mouth's exaggeration, some merchants who were interested in the zealot armor but could not afford the high bidding price also harbored various thoughts. In fact, these merchants who walked the desert all year round sometimes did not have a clear boundary with bandits. When the fireworks exploded in the sky, the noble mage thought that it was the Pig Gang sending a message, but in fact, it was the brothers One-Eye and crooked mouth announcing the star of the show. A few fireworks lit up the night sky of the desert, the flickering light indicating the direction of the stage for all the audience. They're sending a signal flare. Crooked Mouth yelled at the commissioner of the Obsidian Council. "We have to evacuate immediately. More enemies will come here in a while." Hearing this, the young mage who was about to take out darts, ground yellow leaves, and viper stomach pouches immediately stopped his spell-casting preparations and pounced into the sand and rocks where the camel beast was tied up. Because he was wearing the zealot armor, his movements were extremely fast. With a light leap, he could dash dozens of steps away. When there were bandits in front of him, he only needed to casually throw a punch to send the burly man flying. There's something wrong with that spellcaster. Lying on the top of a dune in the distance, a few wandering desert elf warriors who wanted to snatch the food from the pig's mouth observed the situation with infrared vision while whispering, "This might be the power of the zealot armor. Judging from his size, that guy can't be that strong. Unbelievable." In another direction, a merchant and his mercenaries squatted in a makeshift straw hut. He held an enchanted monocle in his hand and observed carefully. On the monocle, the spellcaster doesn't show any magic light. This means that the fanatic armor can indeed increase the wearer's strength without relying on obsidian magic orbs. Dozens of similar comments were given by different spectators at the same time, including the boar, who was affected by the envy of the miser. The bandit leader, who was as fat as a domestic pig and as fierce as a wild boar, roared, "That must be the power of the zealot armor. That abominable little bastard is desecrating this treasure that should belong to me." He licked his lips and took a deep breath of the air mixed with the smell of leather, sweat, and steel. He ordered, "Brace yourselves. Go and kill that little bastard." The sound of a bone whistle sounded in the desert. This was the unique communication method of the pig gang. The short and powerful whistle could travel a distance of a few parsands. According to the boar's command, the teams that had been diverted by the illusion not long ago began to converge and surround the target from the flank. "We have to speed up." One Eye, who had also heard the whistle, looked behind him and reminded Crooked Mouth, who was driving the hunchback forward. "The bandits are about to surround us." If an arrow shot from the darkness pierced through One Eye's neck and knocked him off the hunchback along with his words. "One Eye!" Crooked Mouth shouted, and another crossbow bolt hit the rider. "Damn it!" The noble mage cursed in his heart. He quickly lowered his body and lay on the bumpy back of the beast. He chanted a spell to protect himself from the arrows. Of course, One Eye and Crooked Mouth were not shot to death. Being shot by the crossbows was actually their carefully prepared exit method. The arrows shot out by the crossbows were just an illusion trick. The moment the arrows hit the ground, they fell into the pit with the flippers laid on it. Due to the darkness of the night and the fact that the noble mage could not see for himself due to the shock, One Eye and Crooked Mouth played the curtain call of death. With the sound of a bowstring being pulled, a real crossbow bolt shot out from a tricky angle and sank into the hunchbacked beast's brain. With a mournful cry, the hunchback bent its two front legs and rolled out with its head on the ground. Fortunately, he was wearing the zealot armor. The young mage pushed hard on the back of the hunchback with both hands and jumped out. He was not crushed under the hunchback. Before he had time to make other plans, a large number of bandits roared behind him. He quickly hid behind the dead hunchback. Just as he found cover, a large number of flying axes were thrown in his direction. Poochie, Poochie, the sound of flying axes hitting the dead hunchback was endless. The bandits had just discovered the young mage, and some of them were smart enough to throw some torches over, indicating the location of the target to the others. "Charge!" Boar, who was riding on a six-legged horse, raised his scimitar above his head and made a circle. "Catch that mage, but don't damage his armor. Use nets and anesthetic bags." Hearing their boss's words, the bandits immediately took action. They pulled up nets between two war horses, and those who did not carry nets were given bags of light green anesthetic powder. With the speed of the horses, the bags would immediately explode when thrown out, and the powder inside would form a smog that could cause dizziness. Soon, a cloud of light green smoke appeared beside the dead hunchbacked beast, and several nets were thrown over. While the bandits were waiting for the smoke to disperse with joy, they heard the sound of the nets made of coarse hemp mixed with animal tendons being torn apart. With the strength of the zealot armor, the noble mage actually tore open the net on his body, jumped up from the back of the hunchback, and rushed out of the area covered by the anesthetic smoke. He threw the darts that he had already prepared. The big yellow tree powder and the viper's stomach pouch in his hand turned into a green light after he finished chanting and wrapped around the darts. Melf's acid arrow, a highly lethal spell, originally only had an effective killing radius of about 5 or 6 yards. However, the mage's strength was not what it used to be. The green acid arrow actually crossed a distance of dozens of steps and directly hit the leader of the pig gang, who was screaming in excitement. The fat cheeks of the boar immediately melted, and the bandit leader died in an instant. The bad news of losing their leader made all the bandits present stunned for a moment, until they found that the agile mage was taking advantage of this time to kill his companions, intending to break out of the encirclement. "Kill that guy. He killed the boss. Pull out your knives." The first to react was the second in command of the pig gang, the boar deputy. This veteran bandit was not affected by the Scrooge's envy. He was not worried that the blade of the scimitar would cut the zealot armor, so he decisively changed the previous conservative way of fighting. The noble mage immediately stared at him, but also because he happened to be on his way to break out of the encirclement. The young spellcaster decisively put away the silver knife in his hand, which was used to cut magic materials, and picked up a wooden club full of iron nails from the side of a bandit whose throat had been slit. While waving the club to protect his head, he leaned over and rushed towards the boar deputy, who was organizing the bandits to surround him. The inferior mace hit the shield, which was made of almost the same material, and the huge force broke the arm tied to the leather straps. Along with the momentum, half of the opponent's chest collapsed. The mage held the broken mace in his hand and threw it at another bandit in front of him. The latter's abdomen immediately looked like it had been hit by a crossbow, and his whole body was almost broken in two. The noble mage let out a wild laugh. Although he had lost the obsidian magic beads and casting materials after the fierce battle, he was very confident that he could break out of the encirclement with the zealot armor on his body and run all the way to the meeting point of the council. The people who were secretly observing the battle here were also shocked by his courage, but more of them were envious of the zealot armor on him. They all made up their minds that if they could not get the first zealot armor from the person who escaped tonight, they would at least get a set when the Megalosaurus Pasha announced that the standard zealot armor would be sold in the future. However, they were not our protagonist keys, nor were they One Eye and Crooked Mouth who planned this good show, nor were they the author's favorite readers. They only saw the noble mage leaping forward into the dark desert at the speed of a galloping horse, but they did not know that the core of the armor, the biomass muscle, had consumed more than half of the stored energy. In less than half an hourglass, the armor would become a copper lump that was extremely heavy but did not have the slightest effect of increasing strength. And the mage, who did not carry any supplies and whose physique could only be considered below average, had to carry it on his back and stagger forward in the desert alone. But what did the tragic fate of the Obsidian Council Commissioner have to do with the mastermind behind this good show, the Megalosaurus Pasha Keys? For the evil Penishade Megalosaurus, that guy was nothing more than one of the many selfless contributors on the road to Gnome City's new life. Chapter 188. After the success of the marketing campaign, orders poured in like snowflakes to the young Blue Dragon's factory in Gnome's Midtown. The low-cost biomass muscles, the simple prototype of the metal exoskeleton, and the Medici's standard slatted armor formed the popular standard, zealot armor. The price of this exoskeleton armor was as high as 500 silver cats, and this did not include the cost of purchasing a special maintenance solution from Gnome City for maintenance. Although the price of the latter was only 50 copper coins per pot, one pot would be consumed every month when they were not in battle. When they were in battle, one pot would be consumed every 2 hourglasses. From a long-term point of view, it was still a huge expense. Even so, it was every warrior's dream to own a fanatic armor, especially for those of noble birth. There was no need to train hard day after day. As long as one wore this armor, even an ordinary person could become a warrior with infinite strength. In addition, those who were observant found that as long as the armor was not disassembled to destroy the internal structure, it was possible to install various practical or decorative accessories on the exterior. Many Medici nobles would buy several sets of armor for themselves, modifying them according to their family's decorations or personal preferences. Those who were particularly passionate and wealthy would even buy dozens of sets at once. Due to his knowledge of hunger marketing, Keyes' factory only produced 50 sets of the Mad armor every month. Therefore, if one wanted to buy a set of armor, they had to pay the full price in advance and wait for the delivery schedule. However, the market was still a seller's market. Boxes of silver cats were constantly filling the young blue dragon's pockets. With the support of this sum of money, not only was the reconstruction of Gnome City in full swing, the purchase of a large number of materials for the development of the flying behemoth was also confirmed. The only problem that worried Keyes was the new problem in the development of the flying behemoth. With the current technology, there was no way to cultivate such a huge biological vehicle from the embryo. The Demolic borrowed the suturing methods of some undead creatures to cultivate some functional organs and prepare to fuse them together. However, unlike the supernatural undead creatures that did not possess life, the various organs of the flying behemoth always rejected each other, resulting in a large area of paralysis and death. The solution proposed by Snyder was to transform the various organs into undead, but in this way, the entire sky behemoth would become a huge undead creature. It could only rely on a large amount of negative energy to provide energy, which was very limited. Left with no other choice, the young blue dragon finally decided to bear the pain and attack himself, hoping that his passive adaptation ability would allow him to transfer a part of his characteristics to the flying behemoth's living organs through bloodline modification. After dismissing everyone, Quest used his psychic ability and magic to construct several seals to prevent spies from spying on the entire laboratory. Although the protagonist said that it was for the sake of safety, the author still had to confess to the readers. He was purely afraid of pain, and even more afraid that others would see him cry in pain. Thanks to the estimation of the behemoth's size, the space in the laboratory was very large, enough for the young blue dragon to transform into his true form and stay inside. Keyes used his powerful forelimbs to press down on his tail, and after turning his head in another direction, he used his wings to cover his involuntarily glancing downward. His sharp claws quickly clawed off a scale with flesh on the tip of his tail, and he clenched his teeth to prevent himself from howling in pain. Taking advantage of the short time the scale left his body, Keyes hurriedly used a bloodline modification spell to transplant it into a prototype organ of the flying behemoth that he had already prepared. At this time, his wound had already begun to heal slowly, and new scales were growing out. The self-adaptation ability brought about by the recovery ability had taken effect. At the same time, the organ that was endowed with the flesh of the Megalosaurus was undergoing a drastic change that could be seen with the naked eye. The flesh of the Megalosaurus with scales rapidly grew granulation and continuously drilled under the skin of the organ. Surprisingly, the whole process did not cause any rejection from the organ, as if the organ also knew the benefits of the Megalosaurus flesh. This organ was the special heart in the body of the Blaze Shadow Beast that could digest black oil and was used to provide energy for the flying behemoth. After being modified, not only could it digest black oil, but it could also fully utilize coal, sugar, and other organic materials to convert chemical energy into heat energy. Due to his understanding of his own passive self-adaptation ability, Keyes prepared various materials for the training after the fusion. If the organ obtained some of the young blue dragon's abilities, then it could actively optimize and adjust itself under the passive adaptation situation and continuously improve the efficiency of its own functions. After the coal was thrown into the bioreactor, it began to automatically generate a grinding tissue, grinding the coal into coal powder to increase the combustion efficiency. After the black oil was poured in, the bioreactor began to generate a structure that could atomize the black oil, which is also to increase the fuel utilization efficiency. The young blue dragon then threw in some organic materials, and the biological furnace organ underwent even more astonishing changes. After the self-adaptation took place, the organ first decomposed organic materials into a large amount of hydrogen, water, and other flammable gases. But after burning for a while, it evolved into an even better way of using energy. The hydrogen that would have been burned was attached to a new multi-layer membrane structure, forming an energy supply method similar to a fuel cell. Thanks to Keyes' science and engineering background in his previous life, he later became a programmer. He was very clear about the excellence of this energy use method. It avoided the Carnot cycle theory that the heat engine needed to follow and converted the Gibbs free energy of the chemical energy in the hydrogen fuel into electricity. But this created a new problem. Because it did not have an energy storage system, the surface of the organ was quickly covered with a large amount of electric charge. New granulation grew on the surface of the organ, spreading out and constantly producing a phenomenon of tip discharge. Because of the blood transplant, Keyes clearly felt that he had established a special connection with the organ at this time, and he could control the operation of the organ to a certain extent. At the same time, he could more clearly feel the intention of the organ's evolution. The newly grown granulation crawled out of the culture tank, bypassing the young blue dragon who had turned back into a human and rushed to the other organs in the culture tank in the laboratory. The first to be connected was the sky behemoth's brain. In order to effectively control the behemoth, the brain was designed according to the distributed structure of an insect, and each nerve node was responsible for controlling a part of the behemoth's body. After being connected by the electric tentacles in the biological furnace, the part of the neural network that had not been built was naturally assembled. Keyes could now clearly feel the thoughts conveyed by the sky behemoth, its recognition of the young blue dragon's bloodline, and its incomparable desire to be born. Through the energy supply of the biological furnace, the behemoth's brain had been activated. But at this time, the energy that the furnace could provide was almost exhausted, and the speed of the growth of the tentacles from the furnace and the brain slowed down. Seeing this, Keyes immediately tore off the seal that he had set up before and told his companions to come in quickly to help add fuel and change the nutrients in the culture tank. The entire laboratory immediately turned into a delivery room for the newborn behemoth. The steampunk Demolic commanded the undead workers wearing the working version, fanatic armor, to move buckets of nutrient solution from the nearby warehouse into the laboratory and continuously pour it into the culture tank. The three Ogre brothers were in charge of deploying manpower to transport boxes of coal from a warehouse built further away that was specifically used to store flammable and explosive materials to fuel the biological furnace. Through the psionic ability, Keyes constantly communicated with the behemoth's newborn consciousness. He accurately translated the behemoth's instinctive evolutionary needs to the managers in the various sections of the laboratory and quickly adjusted the allocation of various materials. For a full 10 days, other than the Demolic and his undead workers, everyone in the laboratory, including Keyes, who was responsible for maintaining the psionic connection, relied on the energy potion provided by which Dr. Paru to survive. The entire laboratory, or rather the delivery room of the behemoth, had been heated to an extremely high temperature due to the continuous burning of the biological furnace. Some of the nutrient solution in the culture tank had begun to boil, and the pre-designed vents began to feel a little overwhelmed. But like the behemoth's internal organs that were still thriving, everyone was trying their best to hold on. When a nutrient solution storage was almost exhausted, the growth of the behemoth's internal organs was finally almost complete. The brain and its attached nervous system that had been set up earlier had been greatly perfected, and this also made it much easier for Keyes to communicate. "Father." The words of the flying behemoth were accurately transmitted to the young blue dragon through the psionic connection. This was the first time it did not use instinctive needs, but a complete and meaningful word. I'm ready. Keys also realized this, and the tiredness from maintaining the psionic connection for many days was swept away. He stepped forward, pressed his palm on the behemoth's wrinkled brain, and said softly, I grant thee life, and thy true name is Leviathan. The behemoth, which was about to cover the entire laboratory floor, immediately became excited, and all the tissues began to make the final adjustments. The core brain that carried the behemoths was wrapped in layers of muscles and pushed to the deepest part of the internal organs. At this time, the biological furnace had been split into 4 groups, and other than the entrance to fill the fuel, the furnace itself was also hidden in the depths of the muscles. The airbag skin of the airship seized from the Japanese was pieced together into a huge balloon with many cabins, and it was suspended above the behemoth by a traction device. After receiving Keyes' order, the Leviathan once again grew many tentacles and tightly wrapped the balloon. The original skin was quickly digested, and in its place was the Leviathan's own skin and muscles. The characteristics of the Megalosaurus, which was obtained from the young blue dragon, began to show. The surface of the huge airbag began to grow scales that looked very thin, but could deflect force fields. Hundreds of sharp horns protruded from the surface of the airbag, and the tips were flashing with electric light. The tentacles connecting the Leviathan's internal organs and the airbag began to shrink, pulling the tissues on the ground into the embryonic body. Keyes was a little worried that the traction rope could bear so much weight, and was ready to cast a levitation spell to help the Leviathan complete the final assembly. However, the smart behemoth had already thought of this. It spewed out the high-pressure gas that had accumulated for many days under its body, and at the same time, the biological furnace was turned on, and the hot air was poured into the airbag through the special hollow tentacles. Under the combined efforts of the upper and lower parts, the Leviathan's shell and internal organs were quickly completed, and the Leviathan was finally born. Chapter 189. Mastering Technology. Mastering even more advanced technology. Mastering even more advanced and disruptive technology. My descendants must remember that this is the most effective way to quickly create large amounts of wealth. When the Leviathan rose into the sky, the commercial transportation model of Medicus and the entire Ash world since ancient times had been completely overturned. No one could stop the scales of eternal order from beginning to accumulate wealth. Santos Ben Jozer's book to his descendants, the founder of the Sand Rhino conglomerate and an early member of the Scales of Eternal Order Chamber of Commerce. When the ceiling of the laboratory was pulled up by its hinges, the Leviathan rose from the city center, shocking everyone in Nome. This kind of flying beast that had never appeared in the Ash world first brought endless panic, but after the city guards rushed to inform them, the panic turned into shock in a very short time. After a few days, when the construction of the pod was completed, the huge biological vehicle welcomed its first batch of visitors. Those who were invited by Keyes were all representatives of merchants from all walks of life. Among these people, many did not live in Nome City. But after hearing that Megalosaurus Pasha had built the huge Leviathan, they were all extremely curious. They either rode on the mage's flying carpets or rode on camel beasts overnight to reach Nome City as quickly as possible. The birth of the Leviathan had even spread to the capital of the empire, Bite City. The big-bellied general, who had worked with Keyes before, was the representative. He brought a group of nobles to watch the first flight of the Leviathan. In this regard, although Megalosaurus Pasha had not informed them before, he still expressed a warm welcome. After all, this would be beneficial to further promoting the Leviathan's flying vehicle. But for some unknown reason, the official Medicus group did not use the common flying carpets. Instead, they took a modified Wusan flying ship to Nome City. When this sky fortress that had shrunk several times arrived, the accompanying mages first built a 30-foot-tall obelisk outside the city as a docking tower. Only then could they successfully anchor and dock. Sir Keyes, this was all done by the noble mages at the last minute. When General Medicus met the young blue dragon at the Pasha's camp in the city center, he immediately drew a clear line with the mages of the Obsidian Council. After they heard that you had built a flying ship, I don't know why they went crazy and pieced together this thing from the spoils of War of the Wusan. Through the conversation with the big-bellied general, Keyes learned that this was the work of the Obsidian Council. Recently, the Grand Vader had been in seclusion, causing many people to think that he might have been injured in Japan and was recuperating. And, taking advantage of this opportunity, the Obsidian Council began various actions to expand their influence. One of the most important measures was to suppress the local officials of Medica that the Great Vexil had promoted. Keyes' title of Pasha was the highest position in Medicus that had been granted in recent years. In addition, because he was a megalosaurus, it was not surprising that the Obsidian Council, which was responsible for protecting the interests of noble mages and nobles, would target him. It's really too simple and crude. The young blue dragon, who understood this, secretly complained. He really did not expect that the council would like to fight head-on. Did they not consider the method of bribing? Indeed, the Obsidian Council had disappointed him. The word bribing might not even exist in the dictionary of those noble mages. From her point of view, the existence of the Megalosaurus Pasha was a challenge to the Medicus noble system. The Leviathan, on the other hand, was purely a means for Keyes to show off his military strength, although they had spent a lot of money to buy the fanatic armor. But before the observation group came to Nome, the Obsidian Council had spent a lot of money to repair a Wusan airship and named it the Blazing Sun Ship. It was used to show off their strength to the young blue dragon. While the pot-bellied general was paying a visit to the Megalosaurus Pasha, the noble representatives on the airship were also holding their own meetings. The noble mages sent by the council even used spells to ensure that the content of the conversation would not be detected. As we all know, a middle-aged noble in a dark blue mage robe stroked his beard and said slowly and concisely in a very infectious tone, "The Medici Empire has just experienced the invasion of the Wuzans. Although we were the victors in the end, we still paid a great price. The blizzard disaster, the breach of the Nero River, and the expected crop failure next year. The fiefs of several nobles here have been affected, but the Megalosaurus Pasha who faced the Wusan vanguard seems to have managed his territory very well. The Pong tournament, the fanatic armor, and the Leviathan that we are about to visit, all of these things have brought him a lot of money. But have you thought about where the initial funds for these things came from? The pentashade Megalosaurus, known for its greed for money, is willing to use the silver in its lair? Of course not. The Megalosaurus Pasha collected the huge amount of money by squeezing the property of the nobles of Medici. Seeing that everyone present was attracted by his speech, Lilith nodded slightly with satisfaction. He stretched his hand out of his sleeve and clenched it into a fist. He waved it down and concluded decisively, "Since the initial funds were obtained from the nobles, then we also have the right to benefit from it. I mean, the Leviathan is a good compensation." What a bandit's mindset. What's yours is mine was very similar to the common thinking of the Pentashade dragons. Unfortunately, he was not a megalosaurus, and our protagonist, Keyes, also had the same mindset as him. You mean that the Blazing Sun boat doesn't need to add coal or black oil, but there is a magical item connected to the elemental plane of Earth installed on it, and it can be refueled at any time? Listening to the pot-bellied general's narration, the young blue dragon suddenly became interested in a certain piece of information revealed in the pot-bellied general's words. Sure enough, General Medici thought to himself. Before they set off for Nome City, Commander Wenfeng, who was under the Grand Vader, specially paid a secret visit to him, taught him some words, and told him that he must disclose it to the Megalosaurus Pasha. The airship that the Obsidian Council rushed out has a special magical item called the Olamox Bucket of Waste. With it, you can communicate with the elemental plane of Earth at any time. With a very small amount of precious metals or gems, you can replenish a large amount of black oil, coal, or other fuels that are regarded as waste by the creatures of the elemental plane of Earth at any time. Very detailed information. Keyes thought for a moment and understood that the pot-bellied general was actually a porter. This information was most likely sent to him by the cunning Grandvader. It was another plan to kill two birds with one stone. Not only would he be able to return the favor of helping the Empire of Medici defeat the Japanese Expeditionary Army, but he would also be able to cause a lot of trouble for the Obsidian Council. Another overt plot. Even if he was unwilling, the young blue dragon had to admit that something as good as the Olamak's bucket of waste was delivered to his mouth. How could he not accept it with a smile? Chapter 190. Great Blazing Sun. This was the sentence that the fat merchant Santos said the most after boarding the Leviathan. The second most common sentence was, "What is this for?" Stepping on the non-slip floor made of teak, under the leadership of the Dragonborn clan's Kobold Guide, the Medici's official viewing group, and a group of merchants walked along the corridor of the pod. As the volume of the Leviathan's airbag was far larger than that of the airship outside the city, the interior space of its pod was much larger than that of the Blazing Sun boat. The Leviathan had a total of 5 decks. Unlike the design of the Wusong airship, the top 2 decks of the pod were integrated into the body of the Leviathan's huge airbag. The other 3 decks were exposed to the beast's body. The top deck was used as a passenger cabin, and the other 2 were used to carry cargo. In the process of building the pod, the Leviathan also used its own flesh and blood to fuse with it. The beast had a lifeline extracted from the fluorescent insects, so the corridors and the ceiling of the rooms on each deck were illuminated by a biological light source. As the first batch of flight crew, the members of the Dragonborn clan had a small tin whistle around their necks. They could blow a unique sound to control the light sources on and off. In addition to these biological light sources, there was a round crystal porthole every 20 steps or so on the corridor of the cabin deck. It could be opened and closed with a simple touch. During the day, it could also provide some illumination for this deck. Of course, these portholes could also be used to view the outside scenery, but the best viewing platform was still at the bow. When the visitors walked to the hemispherical space that ran through the 3 decks, everyone was shocked by what they saw. The bottom and outer walls of the hemispherical space were made of 1-yard square glass. In fact, special scales grown by the Leviathan. These glass were tightly wedged in what seemed to be a silver-gray metallic window edge. In fact, part of the Leviathan's skin tissue. The scenery outside is unobstructed. As the guide, the desert kobold eagerly introduced it to the visitors in a proud tone. This is the viewing navigation platform. When it is safe to sail, for example, now, it can be open to you as a viewing platform. At other times, he pointed to his busy compatriots. Some of the Dragonborn clan surveyors were using ropes with pulleys to go up and down between the railings. This is a navigation platform for observation and determining the route. In fact, there are some brave observers doing the same work outside the Leviathan, but I don't think you would like to visit the working environment there. The guide held on to the wall and pretended to almost fall. He also simulated the sound of strong wind whistling in his mouth. Some of the visiting merchants laughed in a friendly manner, but the nobles present remained silent due to their status. How do they send messages? Compared to the others, the boss of the Sand Rhino Caravan, who was familiar with the Megalosaurus Pasha, was obviously more relaxed. The fat merchant asked the guide curiously, "If we go from the outside to the pod, won't it take too much time?" The desert kobold clapped his hands and showed a look of approval. He walked to the cabin wall and unscrewed a metal hoop. A lizard crawled out of the internal pipe. He first tapped the lizard a few times according to a specific rhythm, then said a word in the Draconic language. Then he raised the little fellow to the crowd and said, "Sound transmission lizard," a type of chimera used to transmit sound. As the life-bound beast of a Leviathan, they can imitate large segments of speech and can quickly reach various places through the pipe. Now, I need to provide some hibiscus juice for the guests. We will wait at the bow of the 3rd deck. After waiting for a moment, a kobold dressed as a chef ran over with a pot of hibiscus juice on his shoulder. However, he did not seem to understand the meaning of the guide's words. He did not carry any utensils. So, the guide knocked him on the head, causing the crowd to laugh again. A noble representative in the visiting group proposed to visit the control center of the Leviathan, but this request was rejected by the Kobold Guide. It concerns the safety of the Leviathan. No one, including me, who works or visits on these decks, has the right to enter. Unlike the noble representatives, the visiting merchants were more concerned about the load of the Leviathan. When the guide led them to the cargo hold at the bottom, everyone saw a large number of wide-tailed carriages being pulled by camel beasts into the cargo hold through the gangway at the stern. Those carriages were filled with all kinds of goods, including precious spices, precious wood, unwritten papyrus papers, and so on. These are the materials left by the Lord of the Dragon's nest after the previous pot-buying convention. The total weight is about 1/10 of the net weight of the Leviathan, which is about 25 tons. This batch of goods requires about 30 wide-tailed carriages to pull, and if it were sand rhinos, it would require about 35 sand rhinos to carry it. The kobold of the Dragonborn clan straightened his chest and explained to the people present, and this is only 1/12 of the maximum cargo capacity of the Leviathan. Many merchants, including Santos, gasped. Taking advantage of this opportunity, the desert kobold continued to introduce. The Leviathan can reach a maximum speed of 160 paresin per hourglass. According to calculations, it can also maintain 120 paresin per hourglass when cruising with a full load. In theory, it only takes a little more than half a day to travel from Gnome City to Bite City. Doesn't this mean that all the caravans of Medici will not be able to compete with the Leviathan in the future? A shrewd merchant immediately thought of this question. After this question was raised, the faces of caravan owners like the fat merchant Santos were suddenly clouded with worry. Before the Kobold Guide was about to answer, a person walked in through the entrance of the cargo hold and said loudly, "This problem is indeed possible, but there is a greater possibility of cooperation in the future. The Leviathan, or the flying behemoth after it, is actually not suitable for short-distance transportation in terms of cost. They will establish fixed mooring stations between several key cities in Medici and transport large quantities of goods in fixed shifts. The increase in cargo transport will undoubtedly lead to the need for cargo distribution around the mooring cities, and short-distance transportation caravans are the key to solving this last paresin problem." Everyone looked at the source of the voice, and the fat merchant Santos' eyes lit up. He immediately said, "Honorable Megalosaurus Pasha, the honest merchant Santos Ben Joser sends his sincere greetings to you." Chapter 191. Compared to the Leviathan, the security of the Blazing Sun ship was much stricter. Not only were there many guards patrolling the deck of the ship, but there were also people standing guard under the mooring tower that the mages had temporarily built. Thanks to Olmoc's bucket of waste, the airship only needed to use a small amount of precious metals or gems to get enough fuel from the elemental plane of Earth, so it had never landed on the ground. After the members of the Leviathan's observation group left, the airship was carefully guarded, and the guards did not relax for a moment. Of course, the Blazing Sun ship was not completely cut off from the outside world. Materials such as food, drinking water, and the garbage produced in the ship's hold would be sent out through special cranes. Still, for safety reasons, this internal and external interaction was arranged near noon. At that time, the blazing sun would be hanging in the center of the sky, and the area of the shadows would be reduced to the minimum, making it easier for the guards to check. Accompanied by the tune of the time, the Dolbaka drum, which was specially used to transmit orders, began to beat in an orderly manner. On both sides of the blazing sun ship's deck, two slender brown giant hands stretched out. These arms had thin, mechanical-like bones, and the tendons were clearly visible under the thin skin. This was a pair of enchanted arms that borrowed the technology of flesh and blood golems and chimeras. They were the melee weapons of the blazing sun ship, and, at the same time, they played the role of cranes. The arm that stretched out from the left side of the ship was responsible for throwing the garbage piled up on the deck, and the arm that stretched out from the right side of the ship was responsible for lifting the goods on the ground. In order to maintain balance, The movements of the enchanted arms had to be done in an orderly manner. Below the deck, there were dozens of people constantly tightening 2 sets of springs to provide enough power for the enchanted arms, and the ones controlling them were the 2 senior apprentices left behind by the noble mage, Liliot. The goods purchased from Gnome City were loaded into wide-tailed carriages and pulled to the designated location below the blazing sun ship by the leading camel beasts. In order to not frighten the camel beasts, after the carriages were in place, the beasts would be temporarily unlassoed and pulled to the side to wait. Some hired civilian workers would temporarily take over their work, either pushing or dragging them, fine-tuning the parking positions of these supply vehicles, and assisting the enchanted arm in the grabbing and unloading work. One Eye and Crooked Mouth were disguised among the commoners. As the blazing sun boat had a transfiguration detection formation, it was not easy for Keys's companions to sneak onto the airship, so they could only rely on the 2 brothers to scout. "Do you remember Lord Pasha's instructions?" The shirtless, one-eyed man whispered to his brother. "After we go up, we have to find a place to hide, or we can disguise ourselves as crew members." Crooked Mouth, who was pushing the carriage with one-eyed, looked around. When he saw that no one was paying attention to them, he replied, "I remember all of them, but I'm a little worried about that thing." With that, he pouted his crooked lips and pointed at the airship above his head. Earlier, the 2 of them had taken a flying carpet. When they were high up in the sky, One Eye felt better, but he found that his calves would cramp up when he was on the flying carpet. "Don't worry, didn't you go on the Leviathan once? Weren't you fine at that time?" One Eye comforted him disapprovingly. He even opened his mouth and took out a ring from under his tongue. "Don't you still have the floating ring? In the worst case, this ring can trigger the Featherfall spell to keep you safe." Crooked Mouth nodded and let out a sigh to calm himself down. He then pressed on the floating ring that was hidden somewhere on his body to calm himself down. When the enchanted arm grabbed the carriage they were in charge of, One Eye and Crooked Mouth immediately used an illusion to block the eyes and ears of the other commoners. They then darted into the carriage and hid in the wicker baskets that contained the crew members' clothes. Before the Leviathan was ready to take off, the members of the visitation group were asked to return to their cabins to wait for takeoff. Other than the pot-bellied general who needed to discuss some matters with the Megalosaurus Pasha, the other members of the noble visitation group gathered in Lilith's cabin. The facilities of this airship can be said to be luxurious. One of the nobles took out a bottle of jujube from the wine cabinet fixed to the wall of the cabin. After tasting it, he could not help but praise the food, the wine, and especially the steam bath. The 200 silver cats were well spent. Even Lilith of the Obsidian Council had to admit that compared to the blazing sunboat they took, the Leviathan's degree of comfort was beyond imagination. In the beginning, they all thought that the airship was built by Keys to show off his military strength. But after a tour, even the hostile Lilith changed his opinion. Compared to the ferocious appearance of the Leviathan, the interior of the airship was more like a commercial airship. But as a member of the Obsidian Council, Lilith still insisted on his original plan. He stroked the bronze panels that were used as decorations on the walls of the cabin. The extremely aged patterns were very much to the noble mage's liking. You may have overlooked these antique decorations. Although they were inside the cabin, Lilith still cast a spell to prevent eavesdropping when he spoke. There are a total of 15 luxurious first-class cabins like this on the Leviathan and more second-class cabins. If you don't care about the dignity and comfort of the experience, you can also spend less money in the warehouse. He took out a silver cat with his fingers and held it between 2 fingers, flashing it in front of the noble's eyes. Even if we don't count the freight income, even if we calculate 1/3 of the passenger capacity, the one-way income of the Leviathan is nearly 5,000 silver cats. Compared to the blazing sunboat that required a lot of manpower and can't be maintained, those who control the Dragon Clan are simply slaves of the Megalosaurus Pasha. There's almost no cost. In the future, this airship will simply be a coinage machine that can automatically produce silver cats. Seeing that some of the nobles present had a thoughtful look and some of their eyes showed envy and jealousy, Lilith shrugged and said with a little helplessness, But we have nothing to do with the Medici Empire. Can't we order this airship from Gnome City, just like the Mad Knight armor? Someone impatient asked first. Even if we can't afford the cost, the Honorable Pharaoh will definitely be able to afford it. Lilith praised the somewhat presumptuous speaker in his heart. Of course, he knew the intention of the supporter behind the Obsidian Council. In fact, the reason why the noble mages coveted the Leviathan was because it reflected the personal will of Pharaoh. Lilith's face showed a smile. I also believe that only the great Pharaoh deserves to own the Leviathan. Chapter 192. The fuel hydrogen was converted into electricity in the body of the behemoth, driving the rotor to rotate rapidly, and the propeller began to slowly push the behemoth forward. Untying the mooring rope on the ground, the hot air and hydrogen gradually filled the body of the Leviathan, and it began to climb to the clouds at a gentle angle. Unlike the visitors who were resting in the cabin, the pilots of the Dragonborn clan became extremely busy at the moment. Several teams of desert kobolds ran back and forth in the cargo hold, carefully checking whether the rope net that fixed the cargo was loose. The observers on duty at each key node stared at the recording instrument, sometimes communicating with the navigation platform through the transmission lizard, and sometimes using the sympathetic cilia of the Leviathan inserted into the back of the neck to report to the control center. In the control center of the top 2 floors of the pod, except for keys, only the pilots of the Dragonborn clan who had been transformed by the mental demons could enter. Their main task at this time was to take care of the biological furnace in the body of the Leviathan and continue to send the fuel stored here into it. Some of the desert kobolds with higher intelligence were responsible for correcting the course and using the sympathetic device to transmit the aviation maps and various data sent from the navigation platform and various observation nodes to the brain of the Leviathan. This was to let the newborn behemoth better understand its own situation, so as to lay a memory foundation for future unmanned navigation. Unlike the Dragonborn clan, Keys could maintain communication with the Leviathan through the psionic ability. How do you feel? Do you feel uncomfortable anywhere? The young blue dragon reminded the big baby he had created and asked in detail. Previously, it was just an experimental cruise at a low altitude. When it rises to the top of the troposphere, if there are any problems, communicate with me in time. I feel that the speed can be faster. The Leviathan felt warm to the concern expressed by Keys, but it was still eager to prove itself. It was no different from a child who wanted to show off in front of their father. After the jet propulsion system is activated, according to the Bernoulli principle you described, my body can get more lift. The young blue dragon thought for a moment and felt that there should not be too much of a problem. So he said in the psionic link, using 1/4 of the maximum power for jet propulsion. The purpose of this voyage is to collect more data during the climbing process. Pass this order to all the pilots of the Dragon Clan and ask them to pay attention and cooperate well. In addition, don't relax the monitoring of those people in the cabin. If there are any abnormalities, immediately notify Snade and Paru who are on standby in the laboratory. Your wish is my mission. With the help of the jet power, the Leviathan quickly reached the cruising position. During this process, other than the timely reminder of the diligent observer, the giant beast only noticed the problem of pressurizing the cabin. Other than that, there weren't many problems. Thus, Keys ordered the Cortex Prime to rest temporarily and remember the previous data, while the many subbrains received the command to control the Cortex Prime during cruising. At this altitude, the sandstorm in the desert of the Ashen World would not have much effect, so only the job of calibrating the route needed the special navigators of the Dragon Clan. The city that the Leviathan was going to was Decca City in the south of Medici. This city was a civilization of Salt Lake and the Grand Arena. It was the second hometown of the 3 Ogre brothers. In the Grand Arena, there were still legends about them. Due to its location near a huge salt lake, the city's flora and fauna resources were relatively scarce. Apart from some local organisms that lived with halophilic fungi, there were almost no other organisms that could live there. The reason why Taka City was built there was because the place was rich in lake salt. Compared to the camel beasts, which required at least 1.5 months of transportation, the journey would only take about 3 days with the Leviathan's cruising speed. Even including the additional time needed for purchasing and loading, the total time would not exceed 10 days. Moreover, compared to the traditional caravans that traveled at night and slept in the open, the journey on the Leviathan could be considered a form of enjoyment. After the blazing sun retreated from the horizon, the Megalosaurus Pasha held a sumptuous banquet for the visitors. The restaurant was located in the public resting area on the deck of the cabin. There were carpets hanging on the walls, and there were 3 chandeliers made from the special luminous cilia of the Leviathan on the ceiling. Foldable tables and chairs were joined together to form a long dining table. The food for the banquet was impeccable. There was roasted quail with honey sauce, grouse jelly, and the main dish was charcoal grilled camel made with the help of a biological furnace. Before the meal, there was a thick soup made of vegetables, and after the meal, there was a dessert made of honey. Not only were there light beer, hibiscus juice, jujube, and other common drinks in Medici, but there were also many strong alcoholic drinks with amazing flavors. However, no one knew that the dishes on the table were cooked by the Ogre Blue. The ingredients in the dishes were not bad, but the drinks that the nobles loved so much were mostly the ordinary stock of the gourmet in the lower plains. To the Leviathan, cheers! After tasting a small mouthful of the blood of the Baler, a kind of wine brewed with a very small amount of Baler's blood and the juice of several plants unique to the acid Fog Canyon plain, a noble representative of Bite City jumped up and roared, "Under the glory and protection of the Pharaoh, long live the Obsidian Council." Seeing this, Lilith hurriedly made a gesture and silently recited a spell to make the noble fall asleep quickly. At this time, he was also a little confused. He had just used a spell to detect poison to check the drinks, and the results showed that there was no problem. While the others were taking care of the noble representative, Lilith quietly picked up the cup that the noble had just drunk from and used a spell to check and analyze the composition of the remaining wine. The names of a large number of unknown materials appeared in the noble mage's mind one after another. Only when the last blood of the Baler appeared, he was really surprised. Although he did not know what the other materials were, as a senior spellcaster, he had heard of the name of the Baler, the top demon of the Tanar'ri in the bottomless abyss. Lilith could not help but feel a little anxious. He began to quietly whisper to the other mages in the audience. This is a kind of fine wine brewed with biological materials from other planes. The great Dragon Pasha had unknowingly walked behind Lilith with a thought-provoking smile on his face. If ordinary people drink some of it, it won't do any harm to their bodies. At most, it will only amplify some emotions and make it more suitable for a hearty conversation. Chapter 193. Just like old Agu of Spat City, the ruler of Taka City was also a relative of Pharaoh. However, in terms of bloodline, this consul named Amir was a little further away from the pharaoh than old Agu. However, in terms of reputation, the Emil family, which had been passed down for 3 generations in Taka City, was much better than the Agu family. In addition to the well-known business of selling refined lake salt and operating the Grand Arena, several generations of Emils, nobles in the Ash world, could only use the family name as their own name after inheriting the family head, were very keen on collecting all kinds of treasures. Governor Emil of this generation was even more so, and his passion for collecting was even greater than that of his own ancestors. After the meeting of the Washu Holy Land, Brock killed the mercenary leader of the wandering desert elves and took the elven golden sword fabricated by the Japanese. Originally, he wanted to directly destroy the weapon that might bring disaster to the desert elves, but after communicating with Keys, the young blue dragon found a better home for the golden sword. A month before the first voyage of the Leviathan, Keys sent the desert elf silencer to Taka City with the golden sword as a gift to make friends with Governor Emil, who was fond of collecting. Compared to riding on the Leviathan, the journey up the Nero River by riding a camel beast was neither comfortable nor convenient. The only thing worth mentioning was that with the seal issued by the Megalosaurus Pasha, all the cities along the way could get enough free supplies. Brock had to admit that this was much better than the migration of the Salem tribe that he had escorted with the warriors. Of course, even so, the delegation only arrived at Taka City in the South Emetic a few days before the Leviathan set sail. This is really a salt lake city. Brock could not help but exclaim while waiting to enter the city. After a night's journey, the delegation arrived at the city gate of Taka City at dawn. Many caravans from all over Medic did the same. They spontaneously lined up and waited for the city gate to open. The walls of Taka City were covered with a layer of salt-stained mortar. Under the illumination of the rising sun, they shone with a diamond-like brilliance. There were many buildings with square towers in the city. Even from outside the city, one could see the flags fluttering on the top of the towers. One of the envoys was a gnome merchant who had been to Mocha before. He was eagerly explaining to the desert elves, "Those flags represent the various guilds in Mocha. Merchants from different industries have gathered together to protect the interests of their respective industries in the city. The flag with the hammer pattern is the flag of the Blacksmiths Guild. The black ring pattern on a red background represents the Grand Arena. The leather triangular flag represents the Fur and Cloth Merchants Guild. The flag with the white square pattern on a blue background is the symbol of the largest and most powerful salt guild in Tuka. After visiting His Excellency the Consul, I suggest that we also have a meeting with the senior management of the Salt Workers Guild. At the very least, we can guarantee that the quality of the refined lake salt purchased will be improved by 5%. As he spoke, the merchant gestured as if he was weighing a bag of money. Brock was not disgusted by this. When he was in the Salem tribe, the merchants who wanted to exchange more desert elven specialties from the tribe would also use the method of gifts to make friends with the tribal elders. His Excellency the Pasha has ordered that before the Leviathan arrives, we must prepare at least 150 wagons of refined lake salt in the salt works. Although his voice was not loud, Brock's words were accurately transmitted to the ears of everyone in the envoys due to the effect of the sound spell. The pink refined salt that has been filtered more than 3 times and has been boiled with dead halophilic fungi can be sold for a good price in the central region and even the northern part of Medici. That is our priority purchase target. Everyone in the envoys nodded in agreement. Most of them were merchants with a certain amount of wealth in Nome. They were quite familiar with the work of purchasing trade and were confident that they could serve the Megalosaurus Pasha well. When the blazing sun climbed from the horizon to the sky, the gates of Taka City, which had been closed all night, finally opened to the people who had been waiting in line for a long time. Since they had the official seal issued by Keys, the city guards did not dare to delay. After informing Consul Amir, they directly let the envoys walk out of the queue and enter the gates of Taka City ahead of time. Unlike the desolate saline alkali Gobi outside the city, Taka City was full of vitality. The streets here were in a radial shape, extending outwards in circles. There were man-made flower beds at the small intersections of the streets on each floor. Flowers and shrubs grew luxuriantly. This was thanks to a pioneering work of the Taka Salt Association. When the salt was boiled, due to the special distillation and condensation facilities, the brine extracted from the salt lake was not wasted after evaporation. Instead, it was transformed into distilled water for drinking and irrigation. Every street in Taka City was laid with pipes. The distilled water from the self-made salt factory would be transported to a specific water storage tank through these pipes. As long as the citizens of the city paid a few copper debentures, they could buy enough water for a family to use for a day from the merchants who operated these water storage facilities. The landscape plants in the middle of the streets that were drought-resistant and saline alkali-resistant only needed the merchants nearby to water them with 1 or 2 pots of water every day to survive. This city is a city full of contradictions. Walking on the road to the consul's mansion, the merchants and the envoys kept introducing the various local customs of Taka to Brock. It's located in the saline alkali Gobi, but the city is full of vitality all year round. The citizens are simple, hard-working, and hospitable, but when there's a bloody fight in the Grand Arena, there's no empty seats. The consul's family that rules this city has always been generous. Apart from selling salt and operating the Grand Arena, they rarely compete with the people for benefits. However, the 3 generations of emirs have greedily collected all kinds of novelties. While listening to the merchant's introduction, he observed the bits and pieces of Taka City. Taking advantage of the fact that there were not many pedestrians on the streets, the envoys rode on camel beasts and passed through the streets that had yet to wake up under the guidance of the city guards. A moment later, they arrived at the consul's mansion in Taka City. According to the official rank, Key's title of Pasha was second only to the Grand Vader. It was 1 level higher than the consul. However, due to the fact that Taka City was located in the Serene Alkali Gobi Desert, it was not under the jurisdiction of any Pasha. Its taxes were directly responsible to Pharaoh, and it was an autonomous city belonging to the Emir family. Therefore, the envoys that Brock was part of needed to come to pay a visit instead of note. However, out of respect, the Taka City lord still walked out of the consul's mansion accompanied by the steward and guards to welcome the arrival of the Megalosaurus Pasha's envoys. Chapter 194. Taka City is too salty. Consul Emil joked in the face of the guest who came from afar. That's why I like fresh water, a whole pool of fresh water. Brock smiled politely and sat on a stone bench in the garden under the guidance of the servants in the mansion. Unlike the consul of other cities, Emil preferred to entertain guests and handle official business in the meticulously renovated garden. There was a rectangular reservoir in the garden. The distilled water produced by the salt factory flowed in through the pipes. The pool water gurgled, but did not overflow. The hidden outlet would take away the excess pool water and send it to other places in the city that needed fresh water. Since the water and the outlet pipes were equipped with special filters, some edible fish were also raised in the reservoir. Lush shrubs were planted around the garden, emitting a faint fragrance of vegetation that permeated the air. It's indeed a good place for thinking, the desert elf exclaimed in admiration as he felt the peaceful and quiet atmosphere in the garden. As the owner of the place, Emil waited for the servants to serve the guests drinks to quench their thirst before he said, I have read the official documents and private letters signed by Megalosaurus Pasha. Taka City has always been hospitable to friends who can help us with the lake salt sales. It's just that the purchase that His Excellency mentioned is not a small amount. Even if I mediate, due to the practice of the Salt Guild for more than 100 years, we must first charge you about 1/3 of the cost as a deposit. After listening to the consul's explanation, Brock first expressed his understanding and then asked the accompanying members of the diplomatic group to hand over the gift prepared by Keys. Pick the star iron to forge its edge. Restrain the blazing sun to make its light. Enemies are hard to resist. Day by day, the sword shall be the king of the elves. He recited softly, Megalosaurus Pasha has heard that you like to collect. I wonder how much of the deposit this elven golden sword can offset? He did not ask, are you willing to spend money to collect it? Instead, he directly asked, how much is it? This was something that the young blue dragon had specifically told the desert elf to pay attention to before leaving. It was a simple but effective communication technique. Emil's reaction wasn't out of Keys's expectations. It had an ancient style, intricate vine-shaped hollow blade, a pale golden translucent blade, and a hilt made from the teeth of an extinct ancient megalodon. Just its appearance alone had attracted the attention of this great collector. Be careful of this weapon, Brock reminded when he saw the consul subconsciously trying to touch the golden sword. It is known that this sword has 2 enchantments, sharpness and charm. Due to some historical reasons, my compatriots are quite sensitive to it. But it's also because of these reasons that it must be a very good collectible. A smile appeared on Emil's face. I'm good at taking care of my collections. He winked. I'm famous for being fair when it comes to assessing the value of my collections. There is no haggling like normal merchants, and the great collector, who was both a consul and a noble, gave the golden elven sword a decent price. After successfully completing the visit, the diplomatic party left the consul's mansion with the special purchase certificate signed by Emil. According to the laws of the United States of America, to prevent excessive interaction between city managers, the diplomatic party could not stay overnight in the consul's mansion unless they had the approval of Pharaoh. They walked to the Salt Guild Hall, where most of the merchants who purchased lake salt gathered for meals. Not only did the guild provide good food, but the merchants could also sleep in the long rafter hall. This was the hospitality of the largest guild in Taka City. It was still early in the morning, and only a few merchants were resting on the straw beds in the corner of the hall. Fragrant oatmeal porridge was boiling in the big cauldron, and the merchants who came were allowed to take a bowl for themselves. The diplomatic party had just eaten in the consul's mansion, and only a few people, including Brock, took a bowl of oatmeal. The desert elf took small sips. As expected of the city of Lake Salt, he thought to himself as he swallowed the oatmeal with refined lake salt and sprinkled with dried berries. How may I be of service? With Consul Amir's permission, a deacon in a blue and white striped robe came to greet them not long after they entered the Salt Guild Hall. It was easier to get things done with someone in the court. With someone in charge of meeting them, the diplomatic party did not delay and immediately got busy. A few veteran guards followed the deacon to the mercenary guild to recruit people to look after the goods. Brock and a few merchants who had experience purchasing lake salt followed the deacon to the warehouse of the salt factory with a special purchase certificate. Taka's salt factory was located in the northwest corner of the city, adjacent to the lake. Through the canal connected to the lake water was directly channeled into the salt works. The entire salt factory was close to 1/5 of Taka City and was divided into 4 parts: the salt works, the salt boiling factory, the refinery, and the warehouse. The lake water would first be dried in the salt works, turning into a concentrated brine. Then, the workers would use brine trucks to transport it to the salt boiling factory for further processing. In the beginning, the fuel used to boil the salt was the aquatic vines in the lake that relied on halophilic bacteria. Later, it was discovered that these plants could be refined into a better quality and pale pink lake salt, so they switched to using imported coal from nearby coal-producing cities as fuel. When Brock and the rest arrived at the salt factory, the first batch of brine from the salt works had already been sent into the salt boiling boilers. The chimney, which was much taller than the other tower-like buildings in Taka City, was already emitting thick smoke. The deacon of the Salt Association eagerly led the purchasing representatives of the diplomatic mission to visit the salt-making process. Perhaps it was because they were important customers, or perhaps it was because the governor had specifically instructed him to do so. He grabbed a handful of coarse salt that the workers shoveled from the salt-boiling factory to the refinery and handed it to Brock and the rest. Compared to the sea salt produced by the northern seaside, the quality of Taka's lake salt is undoubtedly much better. Even if the coarse salt has not been refined, after grinding, it is not much different from the Shanghai salt in the market. The deacon looked very proud when he saw that the merchants who had purchased lake salt showed a look of approval after rubbing, smelling, and tasting the salt. He then continued, "But this is not enough. Excellence is the consistent requirement of the Salt Association for the salt factory. The coarse salt will also be sent to the refinery for final processing. It needs to be filtered, screened, and ground. After a series of very strict processes, it will be sent to the merchants who come to purchase it." But when the diplomatic mission expressed their desire to purchase a large amount of pale pink lake salt, the deacon showed a slightly difficult look. Chapter 195. The 2 mages on duty are too diligent. Crooked Mouth, who was hiding in the food storage room, complained. They must be the old gray-robed mages who recently joined the noble mages. They're trying their best to show off to their new masters. Ever since they boarded the Blazing Sun, One Eye and Crooked Mouth had been hiding everywhere. The 2 apprentices left behind by Lilith on the airship would take turns to use spells to investigate the situation on the airship every hourglass. One Eye gestured for Crooked Mouth to keep quiet and pointed to the door of the food storage room. He wanted Crooked Mouth to stop complaining and pay more attention to the situation outside, while One Eye himself was busy preparing the materials needed later. After waiting for about half an hourglass, a chef who was preparing dinner for everyone on the airship came in to collect the ingredients. Thanks to the increasingly skilled illusion tricks, they were no different from the protruding keel in the chef's eyes. "I'm ready," One Eye said in a low voice. "I've already made the sugar into syrup, according to Lord Pasha's instructions." He patted the water sacks filled with sticky syrup on his waist twice and pointed to the remaining sacks on the ground. "The effect of the spell can still be maintained for about half an hourglass. After that, the syrup will gradually solidify." Having said that, One Eye used a blurring spell on himself to make his silhouette blurry and produce different camouflage colors according to the changes in the surrounding environment. "I'll go to the engine room on the port side. You take care of the engine on the starboard side." Crooked Mouth nodded and quickly picked up the remaining water sacks and hung them on his waist like One Eye did. The two of them looked at the door of the storage room for a while and quickly entered the corridor. The Alamaka's waste bucket on the blazing sun provided fuel for the airship. The fuel was not only used to heat the air and ensure that the airbags were filled and the airship was suspended, but was also sent into the engine room to provide energy for the propellers. Unlike the Japanese who used horses and mules to drive the propellers, the noble mages of the Obsidian Council used more advanced technology when modifying the blazing sun ship. They used the limited wish spell to create two special mechanical engines and installed them at the stern to provide the airship with propulsion. These two mechanical engines could not be filled with coal and could only be powered by black oil. After hearing this information from Big Belly, Keys immediately came up with a plan. He sent someone to pour syrup into the engine of the blazing sunboat. When the engine started, it would malfunction. Without power, the airship could only be docked in Nome for maintenance. By then, he would have plenty of time to obtain Olamoki's bucket of waste. And the ones he sent to carry out this sugar-mixing plan were the two brothers, One Eye and Crooked Mouth. Relying on the effect of the blur spell, One Eye managed to avoid several patrolling guards. There was no place to hide under the deck of the blazing sunboat, so his escape was quite thrilling. But on the other hand, the small space made it easier for him to find his target. There were guards standing guard outside the engine room, and there were maintenance personnel on duty inside. Taking advantage of the time when the personnel on duty went out of the cabin to relieve themselves, One Eye used illusion to deceive the guards and sneaked into the engine cabin. As the airship was still hovering, although the engine was being warmed up every day, it was not fully activated. Some of the prepared black oil was packed in buckets and neatly stacked on a special fixed bracket on the wall of the cabin. According to the young Blue Dragon's instructions, One Eye carefully moved the buckets of black oil and squeezed the warm syrup from the water sack into the wooden buckets. After shaking them evenly, he returned them to their original positions. After doing all this, he let out a sigh of relief and then used the same method to deceive the guards and sneak out. When One Eye ran to the designated evacuation point, which was the cabin where the airship's trash was stored, he found Crooked Mouth already waiting there. "Is everything going well?" One Eye asked softly as he took the cloth from Crooked Mouth to block his nose and block out the terrible smell. "Pour it into different buckets of black oil, shake it, and put it away. You didn't miss any of these steps, right?" Crooked Mouth made a reassuring gesture and said, "I guarantee that the steps are exactly the same as Sir Pasha's instructions." He also showed the shriveled water sack at his waist to One Eye. "It's the same as when you came in. How about we find a wicker basket to hide in?" One Eye nodded. The next task was to wait patiently. In the warehouse of the salt factory in Taka City, the deacon of the Salt Industry Guild led Blatch and several purchasing merchants to a smaller warehouse. He ordered someone to open the locked door and led the way in, saying, "Sir, I'm sorry, but I'm sorry. This is all the light pink lake salt we have at present. You have the special purchase certificate issued by His Excellency the Consul, so I can make the decision to let you take away the stock here. Even so, I'm afraid there's no way to meet the purchase quantity you want. Unlike the refined lake salt that was commonly seen in powder form, the light pink lake salt stored in this warehouse had been processed and made into cubes that were about the length of a palm. When it was time to eat, it was easy to use a special salt sieve to scrape it. Due to the high price, Although the climate in the inland area was relatively dry, there were still many moisture-proof measures in this small warehouse. The floor of the warehouse was covered with a layer of pottery, under which there was a layer of charcoal residue that was cooled after the salt was boiled. Every few shelves, there was an open pottery jar filled with coal. At present, there was only about 1/3 of the stock in the entire warehouse, and many shelves were empty. Several merchants in charge of purchasing secretly counted and found that the stock of the powder salt here could only reach about half of the expected purchase quantity at most. Mr. Deacon, after they communicated with Brock, the desert elf asked, "What's the situation?" My companions said that due to the high price, except for some nobles in Bite City, the sales of the powder salt in other areas of Medic are not particularly high. According to the salt production capacity of Taka City, there should be a lot of stock, right? A bitter smile appeared on the deacon's face. He nodded and explained patiently, "You may not know, but that was the situation before. In the past, there were plenty of aquatic vines used to make the powder salt. Until the last 2 years, a water monster that can bewitch people and kill people came out of nowhere from the depths of the salt lake. It turned out that the production of the powder salt was greatly reduced because of the shortage of raw materials. The salt workers usually risked their lives to pick some materials from the salt lake. There was not much powder salt in circulation in the market. Few people would purchase this expensive powder salt on such a large scale like Keys. Therefore, the news of a reduction in production did not spread through the merchants' mouths. Chapter 196. The sky was clear, and the scenery of the salt marsh outside the salt lake was the most beautiful. Known as the mirror of the sky, the Taka salt marsh was like a huge mirror, gathering the blue sky and white clouds into its embrace. Along the pottery pipe that drew the lake water from the salt factory in the city, a boat, with a body like a cabin, with 4 symmetrical wheels installed on the bulwarks, meandered across the mirror-like salt marsh. Unlike the peat swamp, the bottom of the salt marsh was solid salt blocks, which could be crushed by the boat without the risk of sinking. The salt marsh was very shallow, and the water surface was only about 1/10 of the wheel. It didn't matter if the boat accidentally entered a deeper salt lake, because the boat could float on the water surface and move forward with paddles. Of course, this was just a contingency plan, and experienced prospectors rarely encountered such a situation. Even without relying on the pottery pipe of the salt factory, the experienced prospectors could find their way home in the salt marsh, where it was difficult to distinguish the direction. The track left by the previous heavy boat, the direction of the breeze, the saltiness of the salt and the salt marsh in different positions, these could all show them the way. It was because of the unique technology that the prospectors could travel through the salt marsh and search for the floating vines that could be used to make high-end powdered salt. Thanks to the high price of powdered salt, the income of the prospectors in the entire Taka City was at the middle level. Therefore, this technology was very popular and was often only passed down between father and son. Looking at the dozens of vines piled up on the boat, and then looking at his sweaty son pulling the boat forward, the old prospector, sitting cross-legged on the boat, secretly added a few pieces of bacon to the pot of soup simmering on the charcoal stove at his feet. "Gert," the father called his son's name, "let's stop here today. Hurry up and eat something before heading back. There's a beast fight in the grand arena tonight. Bring my little grandson to watch it and have some fun." Hearing his old father calling him, Gert quickly said, "I'm not tired. You can eat first. Let's collect more today. It's almost time for the little guy to be named. I want to spend money to let the mage in the city give him a good name." After that, the young and hard-working material finder pulled the rope and dragged the boat 2 steps forward. He then picked up a piece of floating vine, shook it twice, squeezed out some salt water, and loaded it into the boat. "It's good stuff." Gerd wiped the salt water off his gloves with a rag. "There are some rushes on the pond. They must have drifted here from the depths of the salt lake. The quality of the vines is also not bad, probably worth half a copper debit." His father scooped a bowl of broth for him, but his eyes were looking in the direction of the salt lake. "The wind is blowing." The old prospector narrowed his eyes and stared at the low-hanging clouds floating in the sky like a large mourning veil. After drinking this bowl of broth, let's turn around and go home. Ged still wanted to argue, but when he saw the serious expression on his father's face, he immediately nodded to show his obedience. The old prospector fumbled about in the cabin of the boat, and soon made a simple boom out of 2 sticks and a piece of canvas. At this time, Gerd had finished drinking the broth. After he put away the bowl, he wanted to extinguish the fire in the small charcoal stove. "Don't extinguish the fire," his father, who was setting up the boom on the boat, said without looking back. "It might be troublesome to ignite the fire when we need it later." Not long after the father and son turned around, the breeze from the Salt Lake to Taka City turned into a strong wind, and the clouds in the sky turned leaden. Rustling noises could be heard from the sails on the boat. Waves of wind carried the lake water and slapped against the boat's belly. "Quickly get on the boat." Seeing the water level of the salt marsh began to rise, the old prospector immediately reminded Gerd, "Use the pole first. If the water level rises again, change to the oars. Pay attention to the direction of the sail. Put in more effort, and we'll be safe when we get back to the breakwater." The so-called breakwater referred to a large section of half-moon-shaped embankment built on the edge of the salt marsh south of Taka City and reinforced by the magic of the garrison mages every year. In the earliest days, the breakwater was to prevent the Salt Lake water from pouring into Taka City when it rose. But later, this building also had the function of defending against the invasion of some monsters. With the joint efforts of the strong wind and Gerd, the boat moved forward like a shooting star. In order to make better use of the wind, the old prospector controlled the sails while calling his son to let the boat, which had already floated up, move in a zigzag pattern. The pottery pipe, which was originally used as a reference object, had sunk into the water. Fortunately, the prospector and his son were skilled. The small salt dome that was dug out by the predecessors and piled up could also be used to calibrate the course. At this speed, the old prospector licked his right index finger and raised it vertically above his forehead. The salty wind with the smell of the Salt Lake blew through his wet finger, bringing a chilly feeling. This was one of his techniques to feel the wind. At most in half an hourglass, Gerd's sudden roar interrupted his father's words. "There are monsters following us." The prospector's son stood at the stern of the boat and struggled to hold a long pole, as if he wanted to throw the fear far behind him. "Put in more effort. Give me some time to prepare." After that, the old prospector decisively cut a few pieces of cloth from the corner of the sail with his dagger. Then he pulled out a lot of slightly dry vines from the cargo loaded on the boat. He used the broken canvas strips to tie the vines into palm-sized rattan balls. Finally, he found a water skin and a lot of red willow skewers used for barbecuing from the emergency toolbox in the boat. He stretched his hands out of the boat and carefully smeared the black oil in the water skin on the surface of the rattan balls on the red willow skewers. A little black oil dripped from the rattan balls on the red willow skewers. The old prospector held the rattan balls in his hand as if he was holding a barbecued meat skewer. He found a thick piece of rattan and inserted the meat skewers into the rattan balls one by one before putting them aside properly. The old prospector firmly tied the dagger in his hand to another long pole with a beast's tendon rope and made it into a spear. "Let me hold the boat for a while." He took the pole from Gerd's hand and handed the newly made spear to his son. "Quickly rest your arms for a while and recall how I taught you to use a spear." Gerd looked at the monsters that were following the father and son 100 steps away from them. They were some of the scavengers who had been captured by the more terrifying monsters that had appeared in the depths of the Salt Lake in recent years and transformed into aquatic zombies. He would rather die than become such a disgusting existence. "Okay, father. Today, I still have to take your little grandson to the Grand Arena to check the watch," Gerd said calmly. "We have weapons in our hands, and those monsters are afraid of fire." Gerd held the spear with one hand and bent his other arm in an arc to relax his previously tense muscles. He alternately used this method to relax his arms. Perhaps he was encouraged by his son's words, or perhaps it was because he missed his only grandson. The old prospector's grim face relaxed a little. However, The veins on his arm that was holding the boat were bulging. Facing the salty lake breeze, he began to sing the ancient song of the salt workers. Chapter 197. And then, the desert elf continued to ask, "The wounds on your body do not look like they were caused by the bites and scratches of the aquatic zombies." Gerd was stunned, as if he had not recovered from the great horror that had engulfed Taka City. His voice was like a boat moving forward on the salt marsh. "My father and I used spears and flames to completely kill and incinerate a living corpse. After we were busy for half a day, we were on our way back to Taka City. There was no loss of people or goods. My father was still thinking about going home early so that he could bring his grandson to the grand arena to watch the Battle of the Beasts." Then, the strong prospector's voice was a little sobbing. "It was the vine monsters, the saltwater colloid monsters, and the monster fish that commanded them. My father, children, wife, and most of the people near the salt factory were slaughtered by them. Only a few people, like me, managed to escape." After Gerd finished speaking, he began to cry. Brock patted the young man on the shoulder and stood in the temporary factory set up by the hired guards at the corner of the street. He frowned and stared at the defensive position set up by the garrison mages and city guards in the distance to compete with the monsters for Taka City. Since yesterday afternoon, a large wave of monsters had suddenly formed in the salt lake outside the city and rushed directly into Taka City. The area around the salt factory in the city was quickly conquered. Except for a few people who fled into the salt factory, surrounded by high walls and protected by guards, or fled to other areas of the city, most of the citizens living there were slaughtered. Captain, the member of the diplomatic group who was responsible for recruiting mercenaries. He used to be a reputable caravan guard in Nome, so he spoke in a simple but slightly vulgar manner. The group of little bastards were looking for going to buy some things. They said that swords and arrows are not as effective as burning coal and black oil against the monsters that crawl out of the lake. Brock nodded, asked them to send a few people to go and come back quickly. Judging from the tone of the leader of the guards, he had probably already agreed to his new subordinate suggestion. But out of respect, he came over to inform him. The desert elves did not have any objections to this, but they vaguely reminded him not to let go of too many people. At this time, Taka City was in chaos, and the threshold of the Mercenary Association had been trampled by merchants who paid for protection. It was inevitable that some people would pay a high price to poach the guards hired by the diplomatic corps to increase their own manpower. "Don't worry, Captain," the captain of the escort replied, trying not to let his emotions affect his tone. "You don't know, but the mercenary guild in Taka City is too formal. I took a look and I knew that those bastards are good at using swords. They even signed an agreement with the guild. Mercenaries who betray their employers and lose their credibility can't get any business in Taka City." Just as the two of them were talking, a melodious song came from the street outside. After hearing the familiar song, Getter, who was still depressed in the long rafter hall of the Salt Guild, suddenly perked up. The young and strong prospector grabbed his father's self-made spear and dusted the salt crystals on his clothes that he had not changed overnight. He walked to the unsealed window on the second floor and jumped out. The mercenaries of the diplomatic corps did not seem to be surprised, so they did not stop Getter's action. Out of responsibility for his job, the leader of the guards, who caught a glimpse of the scene, quickly asked, "What's going on? Why didn't you stop that guy? It's fine if he's going to die, but what if he's a spy for those monsters?" Most of the hired warriors ignored the roar of the leader of the guards. They turned around and busied themselves with the preparation work at hand. Only a mercenary who looked a little old, the medical officer of the mercenary team, the chronicler, the clerk, and the professional in external communication, explained to his employer, the leader of the guards of the diplomatic corps, and the desert elf Brock, who came to seek fame. "That young man is a prospector. Of course, he can understand the song that has just been heard. It's a song that the salt workers often sing when they work. The surviving workers from yesterday spontaneously took to the streets today, ready to cooperate with the mages of Taka City and the guards who attacked the monsters near the salt factory. They just want to take revenge or search for their family and friends who only have a slim chance of survival. The words of the old mercenary made the desert elf nod. The leader of the guards of the diplomatic corps, who was born in the city, was in awe. Before they came to Taka City with the diplomatic corps, they had learned from some businessmen that the people of this city were brave, but they did not expect it to be to this extent. In fact, it was not difficult to understand. There were two main reasons for this. First, the city's environment could be said to be poor. 3 generations of the Emil family had worked hard to build Salt Lake City, and at the same time, they had also created a hard-working and brave urban culture. Second, compared to other cities in Medici, Taka City, which was famous for its salt industry, was much richer. The income of salt workers could ensure adequate nutrition for future generations. Take Ged as an example. There were actually many young and strong laborers in Taka City. Citizens of the city under my rule. With the power of magic, the consul's voice resounded throughout the city. I promise you in the name of the Emil family that we will not let go of any monster that has invaded Taka City. Their sudden appearance yesterday indeed caught us off guard, but we have consolidated our position today and are ready to launch a counterattack. The mages of the garrison are ready. The city guards and the volunteers provided by the Mercenary Association are ready. The free salt workers are also sharpening their swords. We will seek justice from them. We will launch our revenge on those monsters. As Emil read the declaration of war against the monsters from the blocks near the salt factory, a military formation surrounded by gray-robed mages began to attack the monsters' occupied area. The vines that were lying in ambush in the green areas of the blocks bore the brunt of the attack. The mages loudly announced the hiding location of the monsters, and soldiers with catapults would immediately run out from the troops. They would throw coals soaked in black oil at the enemies, while their companions would throw a few lit torches. Some black-robed mages simply did not bother with 2 people. When they saw the vines gathering, they would simply gift them with a fireball. Some of the aquatic zombies that suddenly crawled out of the houses were more difficult to deal with. They were not that difficult to deal with. These mutated zombies were also afraid of fire. It was just that in the face of monsters that used to be their friends and family, but now they had turned into man-eating monsters. Even the most hard-hearted humans found it difficult to deal with them. Something is not right. Ged, who was walking in the troops, muttered to himself. Suddenly, he felt as if a basin of boiling water was poured into his head. The young prospector could not help but anxiously shout, "The saltwater colloid monsters yesterday are gone. Everyone, be careful." Yesterday, those monsters that were different from the zombies and vines had left a deep impression on him. Swords, spears, and even fire did not seem to work on the saltwater colloid monsters. When enough of them gathered, they would swarm forward and instantly capture humans, sealing them in the highly concentrated saltwater digestive fluid in their bodies. Chapter 198. Fear could easily turn into hatred. It was a natural and instinctive self-protection reaction. After being attacked by the monsters in the salt lake, all the surviving salt workers took action spontaneously. They followed the army to seek revenge on the murderers who killed their families and friends. Thanks to the spellcasters, the attack by Tuka's side was very smooth. Other than the aquatic zombies that could only be dealt with by the city guards due to emotional reasons, the small fry such as the vine monsters and fish monsters could be dealt with by the militia formed by the strong salt workers. They used the self-controlled spears in their hands, the swords bought from the blacksmith shop, and the lit black oil and red-hot coal. Often, a dozen of them could deal fatal damage to the monsters. Of course, the monsters were not powerless to fight back. Many of the militia who rashly left the group were ambushed by the monsters. In fact, both the vine monsters and the fish monsters were too dangerous for ordinary humans. The devilfish monsters had heads that resembled broadmouths and bulging muscles, and were extremely agile. If they didn't use pole-like weapons to defend against their surprise attacks, they would charge into the formation and cause a large number of casualties with their claws and bites. Although the vine monsters, known as shamblers, were not as fast as the fish monsters. Once they got close to their opponents, they would immediately be violently whipped by their thick vines. What was worse was being tied up by the vines on their bodies. Although the vine monsters looked like piles of rotten vegetables, they were actually intelligent carnivorous plants. When they tied up and tightened their prey, the thorns on the vines would inject digestive enzymes into the prey's body. The only thing that could effectively hurt them was fire. But even if the brain and sensory organs on the vine monsters' heads were burned to death, the main stem hidden inside their thick bodies could still give birth to new vine monsters. Fortunately, humans knew how to learn from their mistakes and could effectively share their experience in the face of a common enemy. The militia formed by the salt factory workers gradually abandoned their swords and began to learn how to use spears to fight against the enemy. The strong ones carried coal and black oil on their backs, while the good throwers threw coal dipped in black oil and lit short torches. Amir, who seemed to have aged a lot overnight, walked down the stairs of the consul's mansion in Taka City. He walked into the underground tomb where his ancestors were buried with the company of his family's consecrated mages. The entrance to the mausoleum was guarded by a few of Emil's grown-up sons with swords in hand. There were even more family warriors guarding the entire mansion. "I'm ready, master." Looking at the other two Emirs, the stone coffins of his ancestors, the old Emir spoke with a firm tone. "Let me take a look at the situation of the battle." The candles on the walls emitted smoke, and the damp air made the smell of burning incense thicker than usual. The light in the mausoleum was also dimmer than he remembered. Hearing the master's request, the old mage nodded his head. He took out a few pink salt crystals that were polished into a hexahedron from his sleeve and threw them into the copper basin filled with clear water. Old Emir took off his shirt and dipped his palm into the copper basin. He scooped up a handful of salty water to wipe his face and chest. The mage chanted an incantation and began to walk clockwise around the consul, who was kneeling on the ground. From time to time, he would sprinkle some colored spices on the consul's body. The spell took effect. The consul of Taka City entered a state of spirit vision by smearing the water with pink salt crystals with runes on it. It was a special prophecy spell that allowed the target to see a certain part of the future. Old Emir's eyes began to emit a pale blue light. The air he breathed turned into pale pink smoke. He felt like he was squeezed out of a ball of viscous liquid. He hesitated for a moment before turning his head to look. He was shocked. In his astral vision, the jelly-like saltwater colloid monsters were neatly stacked together. They were tightly attached to the wall of a tall, ring-shaped building. It was the Grand Colosseum. He immediately realized something. He instinctively wanted to send out the signal he had agreed on with the consecrated mage so that the mage could pull him back to reality. But at that moment, a low murmur entered old Emir's ears. "I don't expect you to really understand how the liquid that can flow into the blood vessels has magical powers that can make people lose their minds and will. But I can teach you how to confuse people's minds, imprison people's senses, or improve reputation, brew glory, and even prevent death." Although old Emir sensed the malice in the unfamiliar voice, he still wanted to learn more while he was in the state of spirit vision. He asked with a trembling voice, "Who are you? Human?" No. The owner of the voice interrupted old Emir's question with a series of negations. "Mortal, don't use your pitiful knowledge to guess my existence. I'm older than the ancient, even older than the so-called gods." As if to accompany the deafening roar, a grayish-green cloud of mucus rose from the center of the grand arena. Even though old Emir knew that he was in the state of spirit vision, he was still frightened. For tentacles stretched out from the huge mucus cloud and peeled off the mucus on the surface to reveal the strange fish hidden inside. It had a pink abdomen, a large horizontal mouth, and 7 pairs of pulsating blue-black special organs that constantly secreted mucus. These were its gills, which could be used to breathe, smell, speak, and secrete mucus to the surrounding area to cover its body. The monster that appeared in old Emir's spirit vision was the mastermind behind the monsters that invaded Taka City. It was a demonic fish that had been left behind since the ancient times. When it was not eating, the demonic fish's closed mouth looked like a pale crease, which also looked like the strange smile on the monster's face. Choose to serve me, and you will be able to obtain my knowledge and power. The three red, oval-shaped eyes on its head shone with a dangerous gleam. The demonic fish used its gills to vibrate the mucus and spoke. Otherwise, you and your city will be destroyed. As expected, although the consul of Taka City did not know what the monster was, he had come up with a countermeasure. He asked in a seemingly respectful manner, "May I know what kind of great being you are?" At the same time, he secretly made a hand gesture to ask for help from the family's consecrated mage who was not in the state of spirit vision. The family's consecrated mage, who had been paying close attention to the progress of the spell, immediately responded. The spell to counter spirit vision was quickly chanted by the mage, and a bottle of special incense was placed under old Amir's nostrils. In the blink of an eye, the illusion formed by the spell began to shatter. Old Amir spun into a shadow and entered the ancestral tomb in the consul's mansion in the illusion. Chapter 199. Master. The Archon let out a pitiful growl. The suffocating feeling made him involuntarily clutch his throat. His skin, exposed to the air, turned red as if he had been scalded. The knowledgeable mage immediately took action. The family's consecrator recognized the curse on his master. He summoned a cloud of clear water out of thin air and wrapped Emil in it. "Breathe the water into your lungs with your nose." The mage shouted through the water and instructed the Archon in a concise manner. "You are now cursed. You can only breathe and move in the water for the time being." Emil's adult sons rushed in after receiving the summons. After listening to the mage's instructions, they quickly sent their attendants to find the largest bathtub in the mansion. The cursed Archon was able to breathe, but he still could not control his voice in the water. Strange fish wrapped in mucus and glug 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 monster. As Emil narrated in the water with a gurgling sound, he roughly described what he saw with his spirit vision. The consecrator's face turned gloomy as he listened. The mage had guessed the culprit from what happened to the Archon, but there was no way to deal with such a powerful demonic fish. To be able to interfere with the prophecy spell and cast the curse on the Archon through telepathy, this demonic fish probably had a very high level of psychic ability. At Emil's request, the family consecrator immediately began to contact the garrison mages of Taka City to share the information with them. At the same time, some attendants were also sent out to inform the Grand Arena to prepare for the surprise attack of the colloid monster. Not good. One of Emil's sons ran in from outside the family mausoleum. He had just received a shocking news from an attendant who had just returned. A large number of saltwater colloid monsters have crawled out of the water pipes connected to the salt factory. They have successfully occupied the Grand Arena. A large number of slave gladiators that are forced to participate in the battle with the new monsters. Amir, who was soaking in the water, closed his eyes in pain. Just like him, a gladiator in the Taka City arena also felt powerless in front of the monster that was attacking him. After the three ogre brothers, who had dominated the Grand Arena for many years, left, Crying Eyes became the new gladiator star. Due to his family's hereditary bestiality, he could transform between human and half-human, half-beast at will, or directly transform into a ferocious, iron-eating beast. Although in the eyes of many people, the slave gladiators had to fight hard every day and lived a miserable life, Crying Eye enjoyed it. Through fighting, he could release the nature of the beast in his body to his heart's content, in case he accumulated too much and completely lost control one day and turned into an even more pathetic beast. Not to mention, as a gladiator star, he could eat barbecue and drink malt beer in addition to fighting and training every day. Until yesterday, the originally scheduled night battle was temporarily canceled because monsters invaded Taka City. After playing with Discus in the room for a while, Crying Eyes drank wine out of boredom. Originally, he imagined that he could drink soup served by the management of the Grand Arena in the morning with a hangover. But who would have thought that what woke him up was the horrified screams of the management? A large number of colloid monsters poured out of the drinking water tank and crazily attacked every creature they encountered. The guards originally wanted to use torches to repel them, but they did not expect that the saltwater colloid monsters had reinforcements. A crustacean monster with 2 pairs of arthropods and a pair of large pincers broke out of the ground in the center of the grand arena. There were many tentacles under their mouth parts, and they constantly rubbed against each other, making a rustling sound. This was the armored ambush monsters using vibration to command the colloid monsters' actions. This amphibious creature, created by the demonic fish, could also communicate with its own kind in this way. Under the command of the armored ambush monsters, the saltwater colloid monsters rushed around, either clinging to the walls of the grand arena, stacking up in layers of scales, or spreading on the yellow sand field of the grand arena as the bottom layer. The gurgling salt spring emerged from the tunnel dug by the armored ambush monsters and began to fill the ring-shaped grand arena. At this time, it had become the bottom of the giant bowl, and the hungry armored ambush monsters began their hunt. Those guys are really hungry. When Crying Eyes knocked out a monster with a wooden bucket dripping with brown malt juice, he had just put on his beloved iron claws and walked out of the room when he saw a shocking scene. After several armored ambush monsters killed a slave gladiator, they enjoyed a feast on the spot. They dismembered the dead prey with their strong chelicerae, breaking it into small pieces and quickly swallowing it. Except for the brain, which was a highly toxic substance for the armored ambush monsters, they would not waste any food. Even the skull would be gnawed to nothing. Crying Eyes swallowed his saliva and endured the discomfort in his stomach. He carefully took off the iron claws and picked up the iron double-headed spear in his room that he had not used for a long time. This was indeed a wise move. The iron claws could make the audience feel a strong sense of appreciation when dealing with flesh and blood opponents. But when facing the armored ambush monsters covered in carapace, the double-headed spear was more practical. Waving the weapon in his hand, the gladiator in the grand arena roared and transformed into his second form of an iron-eating beast with the upper body and the lower body of a human. He rushed into the corridor where the monsters gathered. Flick, kick, stab, push, and chop. The double-headed spear combined the martial arts techniques of the Desert Wind sect passed down in his family, and it brought with it waves of blazing flames that attacked any monster that blocked his path. Every time he swung the double-headed spear, the tip of the double-headed spear could bypass the big pincers and accurately nail into the skull of the armored ambush monsters. One had to admit that Crying Eyes was indeed a gladiator. With a combination of strength, agility, and martial arts skills, he was able to kill the monsters on the entire floor by himself. When he rushed to the door of the gladiator's residence, he did not forget to smash open the door of the dormitory of some other ordinary slave gladiators. He let out his former opponents or teammates so that they could take up their weapons and fight against the endless stream of armored ambush monsters. However, other than gladiator stars like Crying Eyes, the ordinary slave gladiators did not have decent weapons and armor. They could only use the wooden sticks and leather shields that they usually used for training and charged at the monsters with courage. They wanted to rush out of the grand arena, but the walls, doors, and even the cracks of the building had long been blocked by the saltwater colloid monsters with their bodies. Some of the managers of the grand arena had also wanted to escape, but without exception, they were all captured by the almost completely transparent monsters and swallowed into their bodies. Moreover, the saltwater colloid monsters that were piled together seemed to have a much stronger digestive ability. Their bodily fluids and nutrients were constantly seeping into each other. Often, when a colloid monster successfully hunted its prey, it meant that a large number of its kind nearby could get a share of the food. Only a lot of bones, armor, and weapons were left undigested. Some gladiators were unwilling to sit still and wait for death. They found many long pole weapons and tried to pry open the saltwater colloid monsters attached to the door. However, those weapons were eventually swept away by the monster's pseudo-legs. Sniveling Eyes also tried his hand. He used the martial arts of the Desert Wind sect to ignite his double-headed spear with karmic red lotus fire. Although he managed to kill a few colloid monsters, more colloid monsters came to replace him. His previous efforts were in vain. In desperation, the gladiators led by Crying Eyes had no choice but to turn around and attack the armored ambush monsters that had gathered around them. They were making a final attempt to kill their way out of the monsters' encirclement and into the audience seats. Firstly, if they succeeded, they might be able to climb over the wall at the highest point of the audience seats. At that time, they could find a way to climb down and escape into Taka City. Secondly, the water in the Grand Arena was already knee-deep. Except for a few Merrow Mermaid warriors, the other gladiators could not fight normally in such a situation. At this time, they were close to the end of the road. The stair-shaped audience seats were filled with a large number of monsters. More and more armored ambush monsters, vine monsters, and fish monsters emerged from the underground tunnel and poured into the Grand Arena along with the salty lake water. The size of the gladiators' team was gradually shrinking. If they were not careful, someone would be dragged into the group of monsters and be eaten. Crying Eyes ran back and forth on the wet steps, trying to help his companions who were about to exhaust their strength. Although he wanted to ignore the life and death of others, his rationality told him that there was no way he could escape with his own strength. He needed the support of a team. The blue blood of the armored ambush monsters and the red blood of the fish monsters stained Crying Face's white chest. His breastplate and vambraces had been torn apart by the monsters. Even if he did not suffer any fatal injuries, the many scratches on his body were still constantly draining his strength. The dancing double-headed spear was still deadly, but despair gradually emerged in the eyes of those who wielded it. Crying Eyes was not paying attention, and the double-headed spear in his hand was clamped by a slightly larger armored ambush monster with its calicere. Under the monster's strength, the weapon made of wrought iron broke. And because the iron-eating beast warrior wanted to take back his weapon, he suddenly lost his balance and fell on the slippery steps. For a moment, several monsters pounced on Crying Face at the same time. For him, time seemed to have slowed down a lot in an instant. But the pain that he imagined did not appear. Crying Face, who was lying on the ground, opened his eyes, and a young man's face appeared in front of him. "Today is your lucky day." Keys looked at the gladiator who had dark round ears, 2 dark circles under his eyes, black fur on his arms, and a white upper body. He then said with a smile, "Pandaren." Chapter 200. After all, like other worlds, the Ash World was also a face world. It was because of his appearance as an Iron Eater that Crying Face was saved by Keys and escaped with his life. However, before the gladiator could ask what the Pandaren that Keys mentioned was, a shocking figure appeared in his vision. A certain senior in his memory, the Ogre Neru, had appeared in the Grand Arena again. The puddles reached the waist of an ordinary person, but they barely reached the heel of the ogre. He didn't even need to use the ebony chain in his hand. He could crush the besieging monsters to death just by stepping on them with his heavy combat boots. It wasn't easy for him to find an opportunity to fight again. Moreover, he was revisiting his old haunts, so Neru was full of energy. However, the monsters that bore the brunt of his attack were unlucky. The ogre kept swinging his ebony chain, enjoying the pleasure of exploding. Every time he struck, he could clear a large area of empty space. Although the monsters gathered around him fearlessly, the ogre Neru was focused on his work and never tired of it. "Neru, catch 2 of them alive." "No, catch a few more," shouted Brew, who had teleported over from Leviathan with his brothers. The gourmet was very interested in the armored monsters that could bleed blue blood. "I brought a big pot on the Leviathan. I want to try using it to make blue blood sausage and steamed cuisine." Hearing Brew's shout, Neru grinned and said, "As expected of Brew, you always have new ideas." After saying that, he turned his wrist, and the ebony chain from the chained demon caught a plump armored monster like an octopus. With a shake of his hand, the armored monster was thrown to the rear. The pitiful armored monster was stepped on by Brew. The harpoon was sent flying, and the tendons between its calicere and arthropods were quickly cut off. The tentacles under its mouth were also pulled out by the ogre. Maybe we can make a sashimi first. Tearing off one of the armored monster's limbs, the gourmet tasted the white meat inside. He could not help but think of the several food processing methods that Keys mentioned before. Or we can also use wine to process it. Pow! The witch doctor, Paulu, who was the last to arrive, knocked Brew's head with his troll skull cane. How many times have I told you not to eat it raw? Drink some medicine first so that you won't have a stomachache later. Seeing the three ogre brothers, who had once dominated the grand arena, reappear, one of the surviving gladiators cheered. Compared to Keys and Johnson, who looked much thinner, the former gladiator stars were obviously much more reassuring. With the support of the spectators, Nalu, who was still maneuvering among the monsters, instantly pushed the battle passion to the peak. First, he swept out with his ebony thorn chain and whipped the monsters around him away. After freeing up his hands, he took out the newly completed steam repeating crossbow from his dimensional backpack with the help of Snade, the half-lich. He twisted the safety on the steam booster device, and the valve of the small steam furnace immediately made a whining sound. The boiling steam pushed the internal mechanism, and the metal parts quickly twisted together. Although the steam repeating crossbow in his hand was like a small crossbow, the length of the crossbow was actually comparable to the height of a normal person. Nalu raised one arm, and a cruel light flashed in his eyes. Zung! 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 After pulling the trigger, the crossbow bolts were pushed by the bowstring and the steam ejector device, and they pierced through the air with a shrill sound. With the help of a simple mechanical sight and superb eyesight, even if Nalu could not hit the target every time, he rarely missed the target. It had to be admitted that in terms of talent in using shooting weapons, this ogre, who was determined to become a blacksmith and a weapons master, was much better than some of the guys who were body-tracing masters. Facing the dense number of armored ambush monsters, fish monsters, and saltwater colloid monsters, the whaling monster, which had been taken out by the young blue dragon to practice shooting, was suddenly put aside by its owner. In addition to shooting accuracy, the design concept of the steam repeating crossbow also vividly displayed Nalu's talent. As a weapon used to deal with groups of enemies, not only did it have a shooting speed far surpassing other similar weapons in the Ash world, but the crossbow bolts were also quite exquisite. The sharp triangular arrowheads were made of fine iron, and the shaft was made of a tough iron bamboo. 60 bolts filled a drum, and 10 bolts formed a set. The first 9 bolts in each set were filled with refined, light black oil, and the last bolt was filled with explosives and a firing device. The strength of the bolts could not only penetrate the carapace of the armored ambush monsters, but after the shaft shattered, the light black oil inside would also flow out and spread to the surface of the puddles on the ground. Every once in a while, when the explosive bolts exploded on the monsters, they would also ignite the nearby victims who were stained with black oil. Nalu kept pulling the trigger and emptied an entire drum. For a moment, the flames were raging. In the fan-shaped shooting area, even if the aquatic monsters were not shot to death, they were forced to retreat by the flames. About 1/5 of the grand arena was cleared in an instant. It was worth mentioning that when shooting at the monsters, Nalu deliberately chose a direction close to the gate, considerately leaving a safe passage for the surviving gladiators. Moreover, the last set of bolts in the drum were all fired at the layers of saltwater colloid monsters that were attached to the gate. The flames and explosions directly chiseled a hole in the thick iron gate of the grand arena. After doing all this, he waved at the audience who were watching in a daze in the stands at this time. Those who did not buy tickets, Nalu pointed at the hole in the gate where puddles of water were flowing out. Have a safe trip. I won't be sending you off. The shrewd, crying face immediately took action. He first bowed to the senior, who was standing in the arena with a crossbow. Then, he immediately called for his companions to evacuate in an organized manner. But at this moment, Keys, who was also standing in the stands and watching the good show, suddenly jumped up. The sacred samurai Jensen, who also felt that something was wrong, also pulled out his forged steel horse-slaying sword and stopped the gladiators from leaving the audience seats. Like the sound of a drum soaked in water suddenly being hit, a muffled bang suddenly came from the grand arena. The underground holes that the monsters had dug through arched upward, shattered, and erupted at the same time. A large mass of grayish-green mucus gushed out from the ground, instantly dyeing the puddles on the ground light green. A large amount of salt lake water followed closely behind, gushing out from the huge holes that connected together. A wave that was as high as a two-story building formed in the center of the grand arena. All kinds of aquatic monsters were also pushed in all directions by the sudden building of the wave. The brawny ogre, standing in the arena, reacted quickly. The moment the wave formed, he jumped back with all his might, so he was not drowned by the wave. Instead, he landed in the audience seats that were higher up. Chapter 201. The foul smell came from the puddles of water in the arena that were gradually dyed grayish-green. Except for Keys and his companions, the surviving gladiators all had stomach acid because of their weak physique. Be careful. This is a powerful demonic fish. The young blue dragon floating in the air reminded them. Even though he did not see the monster's figure in the slime, he recognized the ancient creature at first glance. As for the word powerful, it was entirely because of the horrible stench of the grayish-green slime. Generally speaking, ordinary people would not vomit if they did not drink the water polluted by the demonic fish. But at this time, just the smell of the polluted water was unbearable for ordinary people. Coupled with the astonishing size of the slime, it was enough to show that this demonic fish had lived for a long time. And like the Megalosaurus, this monster's strength would gradually increase as it grew older. Ignorant mortals! The grayish-green slime rolled, and 4 huge tentacles peeled off the surface of the slime. The ugly fish face was exposed, and the 3 oval-shaped eyeballs flashed with scarlet light. "Oh, there's a young Megalosaurus. You are—" Its words were interrupted by a bolt of thunder from Keys. "Young blue dragon!" The demonic fish that was struck by the lightning roared angrily from its gills. "You're looking for death." Villains often died because they talked too much, but this demonic fish clearly did not have such an awareness. In fact, it was not its fault. As the overlord of the sea in a different world, this strange fish was somewhat confident in its own strength. The origin of the demonic fish race had long been lost in history, and there was no way to verify it. However, any intelligent life that had a deep understanding of the multiverse would agree with the monster's statement that we are older than the gods. In fact, before most of the gods were born, the demonic fish lived in the primordial oceans and underground lakes. They extended their minds outward through their psionic powers, robbing and controlling all kinds of emerging intelligent life in the mortal world, turning these creatures into their own slaves. This kind of rule made the demonic fish race superior to other races, and their status was comparable to the gods. Every demonic fish had perfect memories, and they passed down their knowledge generation after generation. Even if a mortal was lucky enough to defeat a demonic fish, as long as it was not completely dead, the power that could weaken it would be completely engraved in their mind. Due to the memories that had been passed down for generations, it was very difficult for any creature to devise a scheme against the demonic fish. Not only that, but in order to conquer the land, they also modified the armored monsters, an amphibious slave species with great adaptability. They used them as their trusted aides and pawns to participate in the plundering of the land world. The main targets of this kind of plunder were all kinds of creatures that had adapted to living on land. The mucus secreted from the gill openings of the demonic fish had an extremely strong curse power. As long as any creature came into contact with it, there was a certain probability that they would be affected and become aquatic creatures that could only breathe in water. Then, they would be enslaved by the demonic fish and become the backbone of the demonic fish's invasion of the land. This demonic fish had lived in the salt lake for several years and had already figured out the ins and outs of Taka City. The main purpose of this attack was to occupy the grand arena where there were many elite gladiators of the land races. In the past 2 years, the aquatic monsters that were collected and bred in the Salt Lake were not only the main force of the military offensive operation, but also the tools to eliminate the gladiators that the demonic fish had coveted for a long time. However, it did not expect Keys and the others to appear in the end and beat the monster army to the brink of collapse. This caused the demonic fish to appear in advance. With the true knowing vision, it discovered Keys's identity as a megalosaurus. If we can capture and modify a young megalosaurus, even if this operation fails, the harvest will be far beyond our expectations, the demonic fish thought to itself. Every demonic fish is a rich database. It's best if we can capture it so that we can obtain its precious knowledge. The young blue dragon was also scheming in his heart. I remember Keys also talked about a dish, stinky mandarin fish. It should be cooked like this. Blue the ogre opened the food box and took out the cooking guide for ogres that he had written. With the size of this fish, I guess we'll have to replace the steam-repeating crossbow with heavy, explosive arrows. Nalu scratched his head and said to the paladin Jensen, who was standing beside him, and Paulu, who was filling the troll's skull with what our protagonist called Xiang morality potion, with a serious expression. All in all, other than the fearful gladiators led by Crying Face, everybody on the spot had their own plans. The first to attack was the demonic fish that had been electrocuted. Its 4 tentacles swayed quickly, and the 2 forces of magic and psionic energy worked separately. Without the need for materials and incantations, this monster mastered extremely primitive but effective elemental magic. Since its opponent was a blue dragon, although its true knowing vision could see Keys' transformation, it could not completely see Keys' true form. Therefore, the demonic fish chose to use electric immunity to temporarily prevent itself from being electrocuted. Psionic power came from the heart, and it could be used at will. For such a monster, using psionic power was more like an instinct. A swift and hidden psionic blast instantly attacked the young blue dragon. According to the knowledge in the demonic fish's brain, a young megalosaurus like Keys would not be able to resist its psionic attack. He would suddenly hold his head that was in great pain, first transform into a real dragon while howling. And then, there was no then. The young blue dragon only frowned after being attacked by the psionic blast. The demonic fish clearly felt that its psionic power was like a clay ox entering the sea, disappearing without a trace. What was more shocking was yet to come. Keys did not have any random hobbies. Passively taking a beating was never his choice. Following the line of thought constructed by the demonic fish, the young blue dragon also used its psionic power to send back a psionic blast that contained even more powerful psionic energy. The grayish-green mucus cloud kept rolling due to the twitching of the monster inside. The 3 oval-shaped eyeballs above the demonic fish's head all swelled up in an instant, breaking its eyelids and bleeding all over its face. It let out an ear-piercing scream from its gills, and all the aquatic monsters under its control started to move. The saltwater colloid monster quickly built the first protective wall between Keys and the demonic fish. The armored monsters all drilled into the mucus cloud, using their own carapaces to protect their injured master. The demonic fish monsters all became bloodshot and rushed towards the young blue dragon while screaming. This was just the beginning. After a setback, first show weakness to the enemy, then consider using professional knowledge to defend and counterattack. The demonic fish's ancestral memory allowed it to make the most effective move at this moment. Dragon Immobilization Spell. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.